Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? Quiet bedroom as the night deepens, a cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore one of the strangest and most fascinating stories in recent financial history. It begins with 2 pizzas and 10,000 bitcoins, and it unfolds into a tale about digital money, human nature, and the question of what gives anything value. We'll discover how a mysterious person solved a problem that had puzzled computer scientists for decades, how communities formed around a shared dream, and how that dream collided with reality again and again. We'll meet programmers and pizza lovers, idealists and fraudsters, believers and skeptics, and we'll slowly, carefully piece together how cryptocurrency went from an obscure experiment to something that changed how millions of people think about money. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic recounting of price movements or a breathless celebration of getting rich quick. Instead, we'll move slowly and thoughtfully through the early dreams of digital money, through Bitcoin's quiet beginning, and through the cycles of hope and disappointment that followed. We'll take our time with the technology, the stories, the human patterns that repeat across all financial markets. By the end, I think you'll find that cryptocurrency is less about the technology itself, and more about what it reveals about trust, value, and the ways we organize our economic lives together. If you enjoy these calm explorations of financial history, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, and let's begin our slow drift through the story of digital money. There's nowhere you need to be, no prices to check. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in the early days of the internet, long before anyone had heard of Bitcoin. The dream of digital money is older than you might think. It didn't begin with Bitcoin in 2008. It began decades earlier, when the internet was still young and the possibilities seemed limitless. In the 1980s and 1990s, as personal computers spread into homes and universities began connecting to each other through networks that would become the internet, people started asking interesting questions. If we can send text digitally, if we can send images and eventually sound, why can't we send money? Not money transferred between banks which already existed in a limited way, but actual digital cash. Money that could move from person to person directly, without banks or governments in the middle. Money that could be private, like handing someone a $20 bill in person. This seemed like it should be simple. After all, money in bank accounts was already just numbers in databases. But there was a fundamental problem, one that seemed insurmountable for a long time. It's called the double spending problem, and understanding it helps us understand why Bitcoin mattered. Imagine you have a digital file that represents $10. If you email that file to someone as payment, what stops you from also emailing the same file to someone else? Digital files can be copied perfectly and endlessly. A photo sent to one person can be sent to 1,000 people. Each copy is identical, but money can't work that way. If I give you $10, I can't also give that same $10 to someone else. The money has to move from me to you. It has to genuinely change hands. With physical money, this is easy. I hand you a bill, and now I don't have it anymore. The transfer is obvious and final. But with digital information, copying is the default. How do you create digital scarcity? How do you make sure digital money can only be spent once? The traditional answer was centralization. You needed a trusted authority, a bank or a company, to keep track of who owned what. When you wanted to send money digitally, you'd tell the central authority, and they'd subtract from your account and add to someone else's account. They prevented double spending by being the single source of truth. Everyone had to trust them to keep accurate records, to not cheat, to not freeze accounts arbitrarily. This worked, in a sense. Credit cards, PayPal, online banking all operated on this model. But it wasn't really digital cash. It was digital transfer of traditional money, always flowing through institutions that could see everything, control everything, and take fees for their service. For people who dreamed of the internet as a space of freedom and direct peer-to-peer connection, this felt like a compromise, like the internet's potential wasn't being fully realized. A cryptographer named David Chaum understood this tension. In 1983, he published a paper describing something he called _0, a system for anonymous digital payments. His company, DigiCash, launched in 1990 and briefly partnered with a few banks. The technology was elegant. It used cryptography to allow people to make payments that were untraceable, private, like cash. But it still required a central company to prevent double spending, and ultimately DigiCash failed. Banks weren't interested enough. Regular people didn't understand why they needed it. The company went bankrupt in 1998. Around the same time, other experiments emerged. eGold, launched in 1996, tried to create digital currency backed by physical gold. You could open an account and the company claimed to hold actual gold in vaults corresponding to your balance. eGold attracted millions of users at its peak. But it also attracted criminals who appreciated the pseudo-anonymity. The US government eventually shut it down in 2007 for operating without proper licenses and for facilitating illegal activity. There were others, Benz, Flues, Cybercash. Each tried to solve the problem of digital money in different ways. Each failed for different reasons: regulatory trouble, lack of adoption, or simple technical inadequacy. But each failure taught lessons. Each attempt revealed something about what digital money needed to be. Meanwhile, a community was forming. They called themselves cypherpunks, a play on _1_, and they gathered on email mailing lists to discuss cryptography, privacy, and freedom. These were programmers, mathematicians, libertarians, anarchists, and idealists who believed that cryptography could protect individual liberty in the digital age. They worried that governments and corporations would use digital technology to create unprecedented surveillance. They believed that strong encryption and digital privacy tools were essential for human freedom. The cypherpunks discussed digital money frequently. Many of them worked on the problem, proposing systems, sharing ideas, critiquing each other's approaches. They understood the double spending problem. They knew that previous attempts had relied on central authorities, which created points of failure and control. What they wanted was something different, something truly peer-to-peer. Something that didn't require trusting any single entity. One cypherpunk, Waydai, proposed something called Quote 2 in 1998. It existed only as a theoretical paper, never implemented, but it contained interesting ideas. Dai suggested that a network of computers could collectively maintain a ledger of who owned what. The network itself, not a central authority, would be the source of truth. If enough computers agreed on the state of the ledger, double spending could be prevented without anyone being in charge. Another developer, Nick Szabo, proposed Quote 3 in 1998 as well, with similar ideas about decentralized ledgers and using computational work to create digital scarcity. Like B-money, BitGold remained theoretical, never quite solving all the problems well enough to actually launch. The challenge was coordination. How do you get thousands or millions of computers that don't trust each other to agree on a single version of truth? How do you prevent someone from setting up thousands of fake computers to overpower the network and rewrite the ledger? How do you make participation worthwhile so people actually run the network? How do you bootstrap the system from nothing? These were hard problems. Some people thought they might be unsolvable. Centralization, for all its flaws, had advantages. It was simple, efficient. Someone was in charge, and that made everything easier. So through the 1990s and into the 2000s, digital money remained a dream, partially realized in centralized systems like PayPal, but never achieving the vision of true peer-to-peer digital cash. The dream persisted on cypherpunk mailing lists, in academic papers, in conversations between programmers who believed it had to be possible somehow. The pieces of the solution were scattered across different proposals, different ideas, different attempts. What was needed was someone to put all the pieces together in just the right way. That moment was approaching, though no one knew it yet. The world was about to change in ways both subtle and profound. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's pause here for a moment. Let that history settle. The dream of digital money, decades in the making, waiting for the right moment and the right person to finally make it real. Take a breath. Let your mind rest on that image. Smart people working on a difficult problem, failing again and again, but learning with each failure. Building towards something they couldn't quite see yet. We've all experienced that, haven't we? Working towards something, not knowing if it's possible, trying anyway. There's something comforting in knowing that even revolutionary changes begin with humble attempts, with failure, with patient persistence. We'll continue shortly. For now, just rest. The year 2008 arrived with the world in turmoil. Not digital turmoil, not technological crisis, but the old-fashioned kind, the kind that had repeated throughout history. Banks were failing. The housing market had collapsed. Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest and most respected financial institutions in America, declared bankruptcy in September. The global financial system teetered on the edge of complete failure. People watched their retirement savings evaporate. Unemployment climbed. Governments scrambled to bail out banks with taxpayer money. Trillions of dollars created seemingly out of thin air to rescue institutions that were considered too big to fail. There was anger, certainly. A sense that the system was rigged, that ordinary people suffered while the architects of disaster were protected. Trust in financial institutions, already shaky, crumbled further. It was in this atmosphere, in the midst of this crisis, that something remarkable happened. Something that would have seemed insignificant at the time, just another post on an obscure cryptography mailing list. The same kind of mailing list where cypherpunks had been discussing digital money for years. On October 31st, 2008, someone using the name Satoshi Nakamoto posted a message to the cryptography mailing list hosted at metsdao.com. The subject line was simple: Bitcoin P2PE cash paper. The message was brief, almost casual. I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer, with no trusted third party, and then a link to a 9-page PDF document titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. 9 pages. That's all it was. 9 pages that would change how millions of people thought about money, that would create industries and fortunes, that would spark debates about the nature of value itself. But on that October day, it was just another proposal from someone no one had heard of, posted to a list where many proposals had appeared and disappeared over the years. Who was Satoshi Nakamoto? This remains one of the great mysteries of the internet age, and we should approach it calmly. Not as a conspiracy, but as an interesting puzzle. The name was almost certainly a pseudonym. Satoshi is a common Japanese given name. Nakamoto is a common Japanese surname. Together they're unremarkable, which was probably the point. In the months and years that followed, Satoshi communicated through forum posts and emails, always carefully maintaining anonymity. The writing was impeccable English, though whether it was a native speaker or a very skilled non-native speaker remained unclear. Satoshi's posts were technical, focused, helpful to others trying to understand the system. But they revealed nothing personal, no location, no biographical details, nothing that could identify who was behind the pseudonym. Was Satoshi one person or a group? The code suggested a single program, someone with deep knowledge but also human quirks and limitations in the early implementation. The white paper had a consistent voice, but some suspected a team, perhaps from a university or research institution, using a pseudonym to avoid institutional complications. Various people have been suggested as Satoshi over the years. Some claimed to be Satoshi and were quickly proven to be lying. Others were identified by amateur detectives based on writing style analysis or technical similarities, always denying it, and never with definitive proof. The real Satoshi, whoever they were, has remained silent since 2011, disappearing as mysteriously as they appeared. Why the anonymity? Perhaps Satoshi understood that creating a new form of money might attract unwanted attention from governments. Perhaps they wanted the technology to stand on its own merits, without being influenced by the authority or reputation of its creator. Perhaps they simply valued privacy, practicing what the cypherpunks had preached for years. Or perhaps there were other reasons we can only guess at. But the identity of Satoshi, fascinating as it is, matters less than what Satoshi created. Let's turn to that 9-page paper and try to understand what it proposed. The paper began by acknowledging the problem. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. This was the centralization issue the cypherpunks had worried about. Every online transaction required trusting a bank or a company like PayPal. And trust, as Satoshi noted, brought costs, transaction fees, privacy invasion, the inability to make small casual payments because the overhead was too high. What was needed, Satoshi argued, was an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. This was the dream, peer-to-peer digital cash. But how? The solution Satoshi proposed was elegant and built on all those previous attempts we discussed earlier. Imagine a ledger like an accountant's notebook that records every transaction. Alice pays Bob 5 bitcoins. Bob pays Carol 3 bitcoins. Every transaction written down in order. This ledger would be public. Anyone could look at it and see the complete history of every bitcoin, where it came from, where it went. But here's the crucial part. This ledger wouldn't be kept by a bank or a company. It would be kept by everyone. Every computer participating in the Bitcoin network would have a complete copy of the entire ledger. When someone made a transaction, they would broadcast it to the network, and every computer would update its copy of the ledger. This solved the double spending problem in a new way. If Alice tried to spend the same Bitcoin twice, sending it to both Bob and Carol, the network would see both transactions, but only one could be added to the official ledger. The network would collectively decide which transaction was valid, which came first, and reject the other. Alice couldn't cheat because she'd have to somehow convince most of the network to accept her fraudulent transaction, which would be essentially impossible. Satoshi called this ledger the blockchain. Imagine transactions being bundled into blocks, like pages in a book. Each block contains a batch of recent transactions. Each new block is cryptographically linked to the previous block, creating a chain stretching back to the very first block, the Genesis block, hence blockchain. But who decides which transactions go into each block? Who does the work of maintaining this ledger? This is where Satoshi's system became truly clever. Satoshi proposed that special participants, later called miners, would compete to add new blocks to the blockchain. To add a block, a miner would have to solve a difficult mathematical puzzle. This puzzle required enormous computational effort, millions or billions of calculations, but once solved, the answer could be verified quickly and easily by everyone else. Think of it like a Sudoku puzzle, if you'll allow the analogy. Creating the puzzle is easy. Solving it takes time and effort, but once solved, anyone can look at the completed puzzle and confirm the solution is correct in just a moment. Bitcoin's puzzles were similar in spirit, though far more complex mathematically, based on cryptographic hash functions that we don't need to fully understand to grasp the concept. miners would gather up pending transactions, bundle them into a proposed block, and start trying to solve the puzzle. The first miner to solve it would broadcast their block to the network. Everyone else would verify the solution, and if it was correct, they'd add that block to their copy of the blockchain. The winning miner would receive a reward, newly created bitcoins conjured into existence as payment for their computational work. This mining process served multiple purposes. It secured the network because anyone wanting to falsify the blockchain would need to outcompute all the honest miners combined. It distributed new bitcoins in a decentralized way, without any central authority deciding who got them, and it gave people an incentive to participate in maintaining the network. Satoshi had designed the system so that only 21 million bitcoins would ever exist. The mining reward started at 50 bitcoins per block and was programmed to halve every 210,000 blocks, roughly every 4 years. Eventually, around the year 2140, the last bitcoin would be mined. After that, miners would earn only transaction fees. This built-in scarcity was intentional, mimicking precious metals like gold, where the total amount is limited by physical reality. Let's pause and think about what this meant. For the first time, someone had created digital scarcity without requiring a central authority. You couldn't copy a bitcoin the way you could copy a photo or a song. There would only ever be 21 million of them, not because some company decided it, but because the mathematics of the system enforced it. Everyone running the Bitcoin software followed the same rules, and those rules said, 21 million, no more. The white paper explained all of this in technical detail, with calculations about attack scenarios, discussions of privacy considerations, and mathematical proofs of the system's security properties. It was rigorous and thorough. The work of someone who had thought deeply about the problem and its solution. The response from the cryptography mailing list was mixed. Some people immediately saw the potential, others were skeptical. The double spending problem had plagued digital money for decades. Could this really solve it? Some pointed out potential weaknesses or attack vectors. Satoshi responded patiently to criticisms, explaining the system in more detail, addressing concerns, and then, on January 3rd, 2009, Satoshi released the Bitcoin software to the public. It was open source, meaning anyone could examine the code, verify it did what Satoshi claimed, and run it themselves. And Satoshi mined the first block, the Genesis block, block 0. Embedded in that Genesis block was a message, a snippet of text from the Times of London newspaper from that day. Quote 9. It was a timestamp proving the block was created on or after that date, but it was also perhaps a statement, a quiet commentary on the financial system that was failing, a suggestion that Bitcoin represented an alternative. The first version of the Bitcoin software was rough. It was command line only, no graphical interface. It was buggy. It consumed computer resources inefficiently, but it worked. The network came alive, computers talking to each other, maintaining the blockchain together. Satoshi had turned theory into reality. In those early days, very few people paid attention. A handful of cypherpunks downloaded the software, curious to see if this new attempt at digital money would fare better than all the previous attempts. They ran it on their home computers, mined bitcoins easily because there was almost no competition, and discussed it on newly created forums. Bitcoin had no price. How could it? There was nowhere to buy it except by mining it yourself, and there was nothing to buy with it. It was just an experiment, a toy, a curiosity. Numbers on a screen that represented what exactly? They represented transactions recorded on a shared ledger. They represented computational work performed. But did they represent value? That remained to be seen. The world in 2009 was still reeling from financial crisis. Banks that had seemed invincible had collapsed. The housing market continued to deteriorate. Unemployment climbed. Governments pumped trillions into the economy, bailing out institutions, trying to prevent complete collapse. In that context, a strange new form of digital money being created by a mysterious pseudonymous programmer on an obscure mailing list seemed almost absurdly irrelevant. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the best time to plant seeds is when no one's paying attention. Perhaps revolution begins quietly, in the corners, among the curious and the patient, among those willing to experiment without knowing if it will lead anywhere. Bitcoin was alive. The software was running. The blockchain was growing, block by block, transaction by transaction. What it would become, no one knew. Whether it would survive, no one could say. But it existed, which was more than any previous attempt at truly peer-to-peer digital cash could claim. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. A new kind of money being born in the midst of a financial crisis, almost unnoticed, tended by a small community of believers and experimenters. Mining happening on laptop computers in bedrooms and home offices around the world. A shared ledger being maintained by people who mostly didn't know each other, who were connected only by software and by a shared curiosity about whether this strange idea might actually work. The mystery of Satoshi remained. The question of whether Bitcoin would survive remained. The question of whether this digital currency would ever be worth anything, whether anyone would ever accept it in exchange for real goods or services, remained entirely open. But the answer to that last question was approaching. It would arrive in the form of 2 pizzas, a hungry programmer, and 10,000 bitcoins. A transaction that seemed trivial at the time but would become legendary. We'll come to that shortly. For now, rest with this. The dream that had eluded cryptographers and cypherpunks for decades had finally been realized. Digital scarcity without central authority. Peer-to-peer money. Whether it mattered, whether it would last, those were questions for the future. In early 2009, Bitcoin simply existed, waiting to discover what it would become. The months passed slowly through 2009 and into 2010. Bitcoin continued to exist, maintained by a small community of enthusiasts who found the experiment fascinating. The blockchain grew longer, block by block. More people downloaded the software, curious about this new thing, though many grew bored and stopped running it after a while. The difficulty of mining increased gradually as more computers joined the network, though it remained easy enough that anyone with a decent home computer could mine blocks regularly. But Bitcoin still had no established value. You couldn't walk into a store and buy anything with it. There was no exchange rate between bitcoins and dollars or euros or any other currency. If you asked what a bitcoin was worth, the answer was essentially nothing, or perhaps whatever someone might agree to trade for it, which amounted to the same thing. This created an interesting philosophical question. What gives money value? We're so accustomed to money having value that we rarely stop to think about it. A dollar bill is just a piece of paper with ink on it, intrinsically worthless. A number in a bank account is just that, a number in a database. These things have value only because we collectively agree they do, because we can exchange them for goods and services, because we trust that others will accept them. Bitcoin was even more abstract. It wasn't a physical thing at all. It was an entry in a distributed ledger, a cryptographic proof of ownership, a very large number that satisfied certain mathematical properties. For Bitcoin to have value, someone would need to accept it in exchange for something real. Someone would need to make that leap, to say, yes, I'll give you this tangible thing in exchange for your digital token. Various people on the Bitcoin forums discussed this problem throughout 2009 and early 2010. How do you bootstrap value? How do you go from zero to something? Some people tried to calculate Bitcoin's value based on the electricity cost of mining it. If it costs, say, 10 cents worth of electricity to mine a Bitcoin, then surely a Bitcoin should be worth at least 10 cents. But this reasoning was circular. The electricity was only worth spending if the resulting Bitcoin had value. Others pointed to Bitcoin's scarcity and argued that scarcity alone could create value, the way rare stamps or coins have value. But rare things are only valuable if people want them. Scarcity without demand is meaningless. What Bitcoin needed was use, actual transactions. Someone buying something real with Bitcoins, establishing that yes, this digital token can be exchanged for goods and services, it functions as money. This brings us to Laszlo Hanyecz. Laszlo was a programmer living in Jacksonville, Florida. He discovered Bitcoin in the spring of 2010 and became fascinated by it. He was mining Bitcoins on his computer, accumulating them steadily. But they just sat there in his digital wallet, interesting from a technical perspective, but not particularly useful. Laszlo liked pizza. This is a detail that seems trivial but would prove consequential. On May 18, 2010, he made a post on the Bitcoin Talk forum, the main gathering place for the Bitcoin community. The post was casual, almost whimsical. Quote 10. He continued. Quote 11. He even specified his preferences. Quote 12. The offer sat on the forum for a few days. 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. At the time, this seemed roughly fair by the crude estimates of Bitcoin's value that people were making. The electricity cost of mining 10,000 Bitcoins was perhaps $40 or so. 2 large pizzas might cost $20 to $30, depending on where you ordered from. In that sense, the exchange rate was plausible if anyone would actually do it. On May 22nd, someone did. A user named Jeremy Sturdivant, who went by Jerkos on the forum, accepted Laszlo's offer. Jeremy lived in California, so he couldn't deliver the pizzas personally. Instead, he ordered 2 large pizzas from Papa John's in Jacksonville and had them delivered to Laszlo's address. The pizzas cost him about $41, including delivery and tip. Laszlo sent Jeremy 10,000 Bitcoins. The transaction was recorded on the blockchain, visible to anyone who cared to look. Block 71,739. 2 pizzas, paid for with 10,000 Bitcoins. The first documented real-world transaction where Bitcoin was exchanged for tangible goods. Laszlo posted again on the forum. I just want to report that I successfully traded 10,000 Bitcoins for pizza. He shared a photo showing 2 large pizzas in Papa John's boxes sitting on his kitchen counter. They looked entirely ordinary. Standard pizzas with various toppings, the kind you might order any Friday night. Nothing special, except that they represented a milestone. Bitcoin had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a theoretical token, just numbers in a ledger maintained by hobbyists. It was money, because it had been used as money. The exchange rate was now established roughly. If 10,000 Bitcoins could buy $40 worth of pizza, then each Bitcoin was worth about 0.4 of a cent. Not much, but something. A beginning. The Bitcoin community celebrated in its quiet way. The forum filled with congratulatory posts. May 22nd became known, in Bitcoin circles, as Bitcoin Pizza Day. Commemorated annually. Laszlo became a minor celebrity within the community, the guy who bought pizza with Bitcoin, who proved it could be done. Laszlo continued buying pizza with Bitcoin for a while, actually. He made similar offers on the forum several more times over the following months. He didn't seem to view his Bitcoins as precious or as an investment. They were a currency, meant to be spent, and pizza was as good a use as any. Of course, with hindsight, the transaction looks different. 10,000 Bitcoins. In November 2021, when Bitcoin reached its peak price of around $69,000 per coin, those 10,000 Bitcoins would have been worth approximately $690 million. $690 million for 2 pizzas. This has become the punchline of the story, the irony that everyone focuses on. The most expensive pizzas in history. How Laszlo must regret it. How he could have been fabulously wealthy if only he'd held on to those Bitcoins instead of spending them on pizza. But this misses something important. Let's think about it from Laszlo's perspective in May 2010. Bitcoin was an experiment. It might succeed, or it might fail. It probably would fail if we're being honest, because most new currencies fail. Most new technologies fail. The 10,000 bitcoins Laszlo spent had no established value. They couldn't buy anything except what someone agreed to trade for them. By actually spending them, by establishing that they could function as money, Laszlo was helping Bitcoin succeed. If everyone had just hoarded their bitcoins, never spending them, never using them, Bitcoin might have remained a curiosity that never became useful. Value requires exchange. Money that never circulates isn't money, it's just a collector's item or a speculative bet. Laszlo used Bitcoin as it was intended to be used as currency, and in doing so helped it become what it eventually became. Jeremy, the pizza buyer, also made an interesting choice. He spent $41 to acquire 10,000 bitcoins. If he held on to them, that $41 investment would have become worth millions or even hundreds of millions at Bitcoin's peak. Whether he did hold them, whether he sold them years later for a fortune or spent them when they were worth a few $100s or lost them when his hard drive died, we don't know. The anonymity of Bitcoin means many stories remain private, but in that moment, in May 2010, both Laszlo and Jeremy were just people trying something new. Experimenting. Taking a chance on technology that might or might not work out. The eventual value of Bitcoin wasn't foreordained. It wasn't guaranteed. It happened because enough people, like Laszlo and Jeremy, participated in the system, used it, believed in it enough to give it a try. The pizza transaction rippled through the small Bitcoin community. It proved that Bitcoin could work in the real world, that the technology wasn't just theoretical. More people downloaded the software, more people started mining, the forums became more active, developers began proposing improvements to the software, fixing bugs, adding features. In July 2010, a few months after the pizza transaction, an important milestone occurred. The first Bitcoin exchange opened. It was called Mt. Gox, a name that would later become infamous. But in the beginning, it was just a simple website where people could trade bitcoins for dollars. The exchange rate started at about 0.08 of a cent per bitcoin, based on the electricity cost of mining. Having an exchange changed things. Now there was a published price, a number you could point to and say this is what Bitcoin is worth. The price fluctuated, of course. Some days it went up, some days it went down. But it existed, which made Bitcoin feel more real, more legitimate. The early Bitcoin community in 2010 was small and tight-knit. They gathered on the Bitcoin Talk forum discussing technical details, proposing improvements, helping newcomers understand how the system worked. Satoshi was still active, still responding to questions and working on the software. The tone was collaborative, enthusiastic but not manic. These were people interested in technology, in cryptography, in the idea of creating something new. Many of them were libertarians, attracted to Bitcoin's promise of money without government control. Others were simply programmers who found the technical challenge fascinating. Some were privacy advocates, believing that financial privacy was a fundamental human right. And some were just curious, willing to try something because it was different and interesting. Mining Bitcoin in 2010 was easy. You could do it on a regular laptop. The puzzles the network required miners to solve weren't yet difficult enough to require specialized hardware. People mined coins almost casually, running the software in the background while they did other things. The rewards were generous, 50 bitcoins per block, and blocks were found frequently. If you started mining in early 2010 and kept it running for a few months, you could accumulate thousands of bitcoins without much effort or expense. Of course. Those bitcoins weren't worth much. At 0.08 of a cent each, 1,000 bitcoins were worth about $8. Hardly life-changing. But some people accumulated them anyway, either because they believed Bitcoin might become more valuable someday, or because they were being paid for providing a service to the network and it cost them little to keep running the software. The question of what Bitcoin was for, what problem it actually solved, remained somewhat unclear even to many of its early users. It was decentralized, yes, but most people didn't feel oppressed by centralized currency. It allowed pseudonymous transactions, But most people didn't need that. It had a fixed supply cap which appealed to people worried about inflation, but in 2010 inflation wasn't a major concern in most developed countries. What Bitcoin represented more than anything was an idea. The idea that money could be separated from governments and banks. The idea that individuals could transact directly, peer-to-peer, without intermediaries taking fees and monitoring everything. The idea that the rules of a monetary system could be enforced by mathematics and code rather than by institutions and laws. Whether this idea was important, whether it solved real problems or just theoretical ones, remained to be seen. For now, in 2010, Bitcoin was an experiment that had taken its first steps toward becoming real money. The pizza transaction proved it could be done. The exchange gave it a price. The growing community provided users and developers and evangelists. Bitcoin was no longer just Satoshi's invention. It was becoming something collective, something that existed because a community willed it into existence, because people chose to participate. Satoshi could have disappeared at this point and Bitcoin would have continued. In fact, Satoshi did begin to withdraw from active involvement in late 2010, posting less frequently, delegating more to other developers. The blockchain continued to grow, block by block, transaction by transaction. Each block contained the cryptographic signature of the previous block, creating an unbroken chain back to the Genesis block, that first block Satoshi mined in January 2009. The chain was stored on hundreds or thousands of computers around the world, all maintaining identical copies, all verifying new transactions, all working together to maintain a shared record of truth. Think about that for a moment. A record of every transaction, transparent and verifiable, maintained by people who mostly didn't know each other, who had no boss or company coordinating them, who simply ran software that enforced agreed-upon rules. It was a kind of cooperation that didn't fit neatly into traditional categories. Not a company, not a government, not exactly a community in the traditional sense, something new. The pizza might have seemed like a small thing, a trivial transaction, 2 large pizzas with toppings. But it represented a proof of concept. Bitcoin worked. Not just technically, not just as clever code, but as money, as a medium of exchange, as something that could, if enough people agreed, be used to coordinate economic activity. Whether Bitcoin would remain a curiosity used by a small community of enthusiasts, or whether it would grow into something larger, something that would challenge how millions of people thought about money and value and trust, that remained unknown in 2010. The seeds had been planted. The first shoots were visible, but what kind of tree would grow, if any, was still anyone's guess. Let that settle. 2 pizzas, 10,000 bitcoins. A transaction that seemed unremarkable at the time but would be remembered, celebrated, turned into legend. It's strange how history works that way, how the moments that seem ordinary become significant in retrospect, how the full meaning of events only becomes clear years later. Laszlo Hanyecz probably didn't think he was making history when he posted his offer on the forum. He was just hungry and curious whether anyone would actually trade real food for these digital tokens he'd been mining. And Jeremy Sturdivant probably just saw an opportunity to acquire some bitcoins without having to set up mining software on his own computer. 2 people making a simple trade, trying something new, participating in an experiment. That's how change happens, often. Not through grand pronouncements or dramatic events, but through ordinary people trying things, taking small risks, being willing to experiment. The Bitcoin revolution, if we can call it that, began with pizza. Let yourself smile at that absurdity, at the gentle humour in it, and then let it go. Rest with the image of those 2 pizzas sitting on a kitchen counter in Jacksonville, Florida, having just made financial history without anyone quite realising it yet. Will continue soon. The pizza transaction opened a door. Once Bitcoin had proven it could function as money, even in a small way, people began to wonder what else it could do. The community continued to grow through late 2010 and into 2011. More people downloaded the software. More exchanges opened, making it easier to buy and sell bitcoins for traditional currency. And slowly, the price began to climb. In February 2011, Bitcoin reached parity with the US dollar. One Bitcoin equaled $1. This felt significant to the community, a psychological milestone. A Bitcoin wasn't just a fraction of a cent anymore. It was worth as much as a dollar bill. The forums buzzed with excitement. Some people celebrated. Others cautioned that the price might not hold. That this could be temporary enthusiasm rather than fundamental value. The price continued climbing. $2, $3, $5, then $10 in June 2011. This represented a remarkable increase in less than a year. People who had mined bitcoins casually in 2010, accumulating thousands of them when they were nearly worthless, suddenly held assets worth real money. Not life-changing amounts yet, but significant. Enough to make you pause and think. But with growing value came growing attention. And with growing attention came questions about what Bitcoin could be used for, what it should be used for, and what it shouldn't be used for. In June 2011, a long article appeared on the website Gawker. The headline was provocative. The underground website where you can buy any drug imaginable. The article described something called Silk Road, a website accessible only through Tor, special software that anonymized internet traffic. On Silk Road, people bought and sold illegal drugs using Bitcoin as payment. The site operated like an online marketplace similar to eBay or Amazon, except the products were marijuana, cocaine, ecstasy, prescription drugs without prescriptions, and other controlled substances. Sellers shipped products through the mail. Buyers paid with Bitcoin. The anonymity of Tor combined with the pseudonymity of Bitcoin created a system where transactions were difficult for law enforcement to trace. Silk Road had launched in February 2011, just a few months before the Gawker article. It was created by someone calling himself Dread Pirate Roberts, a reference to the movie The Princess Bride, another pseudonymous figure whose real identity was hidden. Dread Pirate Roberts positioned Silk Road as a libertarian project, arguing that people should have the right to buy and sell what they wanted without government interference, that the war on drugs was unjust, that Silk Road was providing a service by creating a safer marketplace than street corners. The Bitcoin community had mixed reactions to Silk Road's existence. Some people were horrified. They worried that association with drug trafficking would destroy Bitcoin's reputation, would bring down law enforcement attention, would confirm every suspicion that digital currency was just a tool for criminals. They argued that Bitcoin needed to distance itself from illegal uses if it wanted mainstream acceptance. Others saw Silk Road as validation of Bitcoin's core properties. The fact that Bitcoin enabled censorship-resistant transactions, that no authority could freeze accounts or block payments, that individuals could transact directly without intermediaries, these were features, not bugs. If some people used those features for activities that were illegal, but that they believed should be legal, well, that was the point of creating an uncensorable currency. And some people simply observe that every tool can be used for both legitimate and illegitimate purposes. Cash is used by drug dealers and also by everyone else. The internet enables crime and also enables countless beneficial activities. The question wasn't whether Bitcoin would be used for illegal purposes, because obviously it would be, but whether the beneficial uses would outweigh the harmful ones. The Gawker article brought Silk Road to much wider attention. Traffic to the site increased dramatically. More drug dealers and buyers discovered it. The volume of Bitcoin transactions flowing through Silk Road grew. And the price of Bitcoin continued to rise, partly because of increased demand from people who wanted to use it on Silk Road. This created a dilemma. Bitcoin's price was rising, which was good for people who held Bitcoins and wanted to see the currency succeed. But the rise was partly fueled by illegal activity, which created legal and ethical complications. The technology was working as designed, enabling peer-to-peer transactions without censorship. But the consequences of that design choice included facilitating drug sales. Within weeks of the Gawker article, US senators began writing letters expressing concern about Bitcoin and its use on Silk Road. Law enforcement agencies started investigating. The media coverage intensified, most of it focusing on the criminal uses rather than the technology itself or the legitimate use cases. This was Bitcoin's first major encounter with the tension between ideals and reality. The cypherpunks who dreamed of digital currency envisioned freedom from government control, financial privacy, individual sovereignty. But freedom cuts both ways. Freedom for political dissidents to receive donations without government interference is the same freedom that enables drug dealers to receive payments without government interference. The technology doesn't discriminate. The price volatility that characterized Bitcoin was also becoming apparent in 2011. After reaching about $32 in June, the price crashed back down to about $2 by November. An 80% decline in just a few months. This would become a pattern with Bitcoin, dramatic rises followed by dramatic falls. Boom and bust cycles that attracted speculators and terrified anyone looking for stability. What caused these wild swings? Partly it was the thinness of the market. Not that many people owned Bitcoins. Not that many Bitcoins were being traded on exchanges. A relatively small amount of buying or selling could move the price significantly. When enthusiasm spread and people rushed to buy, the price spiked. When fear took over and people rushed to sell, the price crashed. But it was also about the fundamental uncertainty of what Bitcoin was worth. There was no standard model for valuing a cryptocurrency. It didn't generate cash flows like a stock. It didn't have industrial uses like a commodity. It wasn't backed by a government like a traditional currency. Its value depended entirely on what people believed it would be worth in the future, on whether it would be widely adopted, on whether it would survive at all. This made Bitcoin highly susceptible to sentiment. Good news would send the price soaring as people extrapolated forward, imagining a future where Bitcoin was widely used and therefore much more valuable. Bad news would send the price crashing as people worried that Bitcoin would fail, that governments would ban it, that better alternatives would replace it. In August 2011, the first significant Bitcoin exchange hack occurred. An exchange called Bitomat lost its wallet backup, and with it about 17,000 Bitcoins belonging to users. The Bitcoins weren't stolen exactly, they were lost, made permanently inaccessible because the cryptographic keys needed to access them were gone. This highlighted another risk of Bitcoin. Unlike a bank account that could be recovered if you forgot your password, Bitcoin gave you complete control but also complete responsibility. Lose your private keys and your Bitcoins were gone forever, irretrievable. Then in October 2011, a larger problem hit. Mt. Gox, which had become the dominant Bitcoin exchange handling about 70% of all Bitcoin trading volume, suffered a hack. Someone gained access to an administrative account and used it to manipulate the price. The attacker sold a huge number of Bitcoins that didn't actually belong to them, driving the price on Mt. Gox briefly down to near zero. Then they withdrew other users' Bitcoins before Mt. Gox caught the problem and halted trading. Mt. Gox eventually resolved the immediate crisis, rolling back fraudulent transactions and promising to make users whole. But the incident revealed how vulnerable these early exchanges were. They were often run by small teams without extensive security expertise. They held large amounts of Bitcoin in online wallets that were potentially accessible to hackers, and they operated in a legal grey area without the regulations and oversight that protected traditional financial institutions. For people who had bought Bitcoins and stored them on Mt. Gox or other exchanges, these incidents were terrifying. Your money was sitting on a website run by people you didn't know, protected by security measures you couldn't verify, in a system with no deposit insurance and no regulatory protection. If the exchange was hacked or the operators disappeared with the funds, you might lose everything with no recourse. The Bitcoin community began developing the phrase, quote, 16. The idea was that you should hold your own Bitcoins in a wallet you controlled, with private keys stored on your own computer rather than leaving them on an exchange. This was more secure in one sense, you were protected from exchange hacks. But it was less secure in another sense if your computer crashed or was stolen or you forgot your password. Your bitcoins could be lost forever. Through all of this, through the price volatility and the exchange hacks and the association with Silk Road, Bitcoin continued to function at a technical level. The blockchain kept growing, miners kept mining, transactions kept being processed. The core technology was sound. The problems were in the human system built on top of it. The exchanges and marketplaces and services that tried to make Bitcoin easier to use but introduced new vulnerabilities in the process. By late 2011, the Bitcoin community was splitting into different camps with different visions. Some people saw Bitcoin primarily as an investment, a speculative asset that would increase in value as adoption grew. They talked about Bitcoin's fixed supply and argued it would become digital gold, a store of value protected from inflation. They were less interested in using Bitcoin to buy things and more interested in holding it as it appreciated. Others saw Bitcoin primarily as a currency, a medium of exchange for buying goods and services. They wanted more merchants to accept Bitcoin, more people to use it for everyday transactions. They worried that if Bitcoin became just a speculative asset rather than a useful currency, it would fail to achieve its potential. Still others saw Bitcoin primarily as a political project, a tool for resisting government control and preserving financial privacy. They were attracted to its censorship resistance, its ability to root around authority. Some of these people had libertarian or anarchist leanings. Others were privacy advocates who worried about surveillance. The technology aligned with their values regardless of price or practical utility. And some people saw Bitcoin primarily as a technology platform, a foundation for building new kinds of applications. They were less interested in Bitcoin itself and more interested in the blockchain concept, the idea of a decentralized ledger that could be used for purposes beyond currency. These different visions coexisted uneasily. They weren't necessarily incompatible, Bitcoin could be all of these things simultaneously, but they led to different priorities, different ideas about how Bitcoin should develop, different opinions about what changes to the software should be made. Satoshi Nakamoto had largely withdrawn from public involvement by mid-2011. His last known communication was in April 2011, when he sent an email to a fellow developer saying he had quote 17 and that Bitcoin was quote 18. After that, silence. The pseudonymous creator disappeared, leaving Bitcoin to the community. This was probably healthy for Bitcoin's decentralization. As long as Satoshi was active, he was a central authority figure, someone whose opinion carried special weight. With Satoshi gone, Bitcoin truly became a project without a leader, governed by rough consensus among developers and users. But Satoshi's disappearance also meant leaving behind approximately 1 million Bitcoins that he had mined in Bitcoin's early days. These coins sat in their addresses, untouched, visible on the blockchain but never moved. As Bitcoin's price rose, this became an enormous hoard. At $10 per Bitcoin, Satoshi's coins were worth about $10 million. At $30, about $30 million. If Bitcoin continued to rise, Satoshi would become extraordinarily wealthy, at least on paper, though whether Satoshi could or would ever access those coins remained unknown. Through 2011 and into 2012, Bitcoin settled into a quieter period. The price stabilized in the low single digits, varying between $2 and $5. The media attention faded. Silk Road continued operating, but it was no longer novel or newsworthy. The community kept building, kept experimenting, kept trying to solve the practical problems of making Bitcoin useful. WikiLeaks began accepting Bitcoin donations in June 2011, after being cut off from traditional payment processors like PayPal and Visa following their publication of classified US government documents. This highlighted one of Bitcoin's potential use cases, providing financial access to organizations that had been deplatformed by traditional financial institutions. Whether you believed WikiLeaks should have been deplatformed or not, the fact that Bitcoin could root around such blockages demonstrated its censorship resistance in practice. The community also grappled with questions of regulation and legality. In different countries, authorities were starting to notice Bitcoin and consider how existing laws applied to it. Was it a currency, a commodity, a security? Each classification would bring different regulations. Some countries took a permissive approach, allowing Bitcoin to develop while monitoring it for illegal activity. Others took a more hostile stance, warning citizens against using it or attempting to ban it outright. These early years, 2011 and 2012, were a formative period. Bitcoin had proven it could survive its creator's departure. It had weathered price crashes and exchange hacks. It had demonstrated use cases, both legal and illegal. It had attracted a diverse community of believers, skeptics, developers, investors, and users. But it remained marginal, used by perhaps tens of thousands of people worldwide, worth a total of perhaps $50 million across all 21 million eventual Bitcoins. To most people, Bitcoin was unknown. To those who had heard of it, it was either an interesting curiosity, a speculative gamble, or a tool for criminals. The idea that it might someday be discussed by central banks and integrated into the traditional financial system would have seemed absurd. Yet the seeds of everything that would come later were present in these early years. The boom and bust cycles, the tension between different visions of what Bitcoin should be, the regulatory uncertainty, the spectacular hacks and frauds. The true believers who held through crashes because they believed in the long-term vision, the speculators who bought and sold trying to time the market, the criminals who used Bitcoin's properties for illegal ends, the idealists who saw it as a tool for freedom and privacy. All of these elements were already visible in 2011 and 2012. The scale would grow enormously. The amounts of money involved would become staggering. But the patterns were established early. In those quiet years when Bitcoin was still small enough that everyone in the community felt like pioneers exploring new territory together. Let that settle for a moment. The complexity of it. Bitcoin wasn't a simple story of technology succeeding or failing. It was a story of human motivations intersecting with new capabilities, privacy and crime, freedom and chaos, innovation and fraud, idealism and greed, all mixed together, all enabled by the same underlying technology. Think about the person who bought Bitcoins in early 2011 at $1, watched them rise to $30 and felt wealthy, then watched them crash to $2 and felt devastated. Did they hold through the crash, believe in the long-term vision? Did they sell at a loss, deciding it was too risky? Did they buy more during the crash, seeing opportunity? Each person made different choices based on their circumstances, their risk tolerance, their beliefs about the future. Or think about the developers working on Bitcoin, writing code, fixing bugs, proposing improvements, doing this work often for free or for small donations because they believed in the project. They were building infrastructure for a financial system that might never be widely used, might be shut down by governments, might be superseded by better alternatives, but they built anyway because the work was interesting and important regardless of outcome. Bitcoin in these early years was still mostly a dream, still mostly potential rather than reality. But dreams can be powerful. They can motivate people to build, to experiment, to take risks. Whether the dream of decentralized digital currency would be fully realized, partially realized, or would collapse entirely remained an open question as 2012 turned to 2013. The blockchain continued growing, block by block. The network continued operating, maintained by miners scattered around the world, and somewhere decisions were being made, paths were being chosen that would determine whether Bitcoin would remain a niche experiment or would grow into something that would touch millions of lives and challenge fundamental assumptions about how money works. We'll continue forward into 2013 shortly, into the first major boom that would bring Bitcoin to mainstream attention and begin the cycle that would repeat with variations again and again. But for now, rest with these images of early Bitcoin. Small communities on forums, exchange hacks and recovery, price charts swinging wildly, the sense of participating in something new, something uncertain, something that might fail spectacularly or might succeed beyond anyone's imagination. Let your breathing slow. Let these details wash over you without needing to remember them all. The story continues, but you can drift if you need to. That's perfectly fine. We're here to explore together, but there's no test, no requirement that you stay alert through every detail. Just let it flow, like watching water move downstream, interesting where you focus on it, peaceful when you let your attention soften. We'll continue soon. The year 2013 began quietly for Bitcoin, with the price hovering around $13. The community continued its work, developers improving the software, merchants slowly beginning to accept Bitcoin as payment, exchanges trying to build better security after the hacks of previous years. There was a sense of patient optimism, a feeling that Bitcoin had survived its early challenges and might be ready to grow. Then something happened that would demonstrate both Bitcoin's potential and its fragility. In March 2013, a banking crisis erupted in Cyprus, a small island nation in the Mediterranean. The details were complex, involving exposure to Greek debt and over-leveraged banks, but the outcome was stark. The Cypriot government, with the backing of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, announced that bank deposits above €100,000 would be subject to a haircut, a forced reduction of up to 40% to help recapitalise the failing banks. Think about what this meant. People who had money in Cypriot banks, people who believed their deposits were safe, suddenly learned that a significant portion of their savings would be seized to pay for the bank's mistakes. The anger was immediate and intense. Protesters filled the streets. People rushed to ATMs to withdraw cash, but the government imposed capital controls limiting how much could be withdrawn. For Bitcoin advocates, this was a perfect example of the problem Bitcoin was designed to solve. Banks and governments could freeze accounts, impose controls, seize deposits, but Bitcoin couldn't be frozen. It couldn't be seized by authorities. If you held your own private keys, your Bitcoins were yours absolutely, beyond the reach of any government or institution. News of the Cyprus crisis spread through the Bitcoin community, and the price began to rise. People in Cyprus and other European countries worried about banking stability started buying Bitcoin as a hedge, as a way to move wealth outside the traditional banking system. The price climbed from around $40 in early March to over $200 by early April. But this was just the beginning. Bitcoin was entering its first true speculative mania, driven by a combination of the Cyprus situation, growing media attention, and the self-reinforcing dynamics of a price bubble. As the price rose, more people heard about Bitcoin. As more people heard about it, more people bought in, driving the price higher. The media coverage intensified, with headlines about this mysterious digital currency that was soaring in value. By early April 2013, Bitcoin reached $100. By mid-April, it touched $266. This represented a 20-fold increase from the beginning of the year. People who had bought Bitcoin at $10 and held through the previous crashes suddenly found themselves sitting on enormous gains. A $1,000 investment from January was now worth over $25,000. The forums filled with celebration and disbelief. Stories emerged of early adopters who had accumulated thousands of Bitcoins when they were worth pennies and now found themselves millionaires, at least on paper. There were tales of people discovering old hard drives with forgotten Bitcoin wallets containing fortunes. And there were regrets. People who had owned Bitcoins in 2010 or 2011 and sold them for a few dollars, missing the massive appreciation. The media coverage shifted from treating Bitcoin as a curiosity to treating it as a legitimate financial story. Major news outlets ran features explaining what Bitcoin was, how it worked, why people were interested. Television shows brought on Bitcoin experts to discuss the rise. Suddenly everyone seemed to know someone who was making money with Bitcoin, or at least everyone had heard of it. This attention brought new participants. People who had never heard of Bitcoin 6 months earlier were creating accounts on exchanges, buying in, hoping to catch the wave. The user base expanded rapidly. The daily transaction volume increased. Bitcoin was going mainstream, or at least it seemed that way. But then in April 2013, the price crashed. From its peak of $266, Bitcoin fell to around $50 within days, losing more than 80% of its value. The crash was violent and swift, driven by a combination of technical problems at Mt. Gox, the dominant exchange, which couldn't handle the trading volume and temporarily halted withdrawals, and by simple profit-taking from people who had bought in earlier and wanted to lock in their gains. For those who'd bought near the top, this was devastating. If you had invested $10,000 at $250 per Bitcoin, your investment was now worth about $2,000. Stories emerged of people who had put their life savings into Bitcoin at the peak, believing it would continue rising forever, now watching those savings evaporate. The price stabilized through the summer of 2013 at around $100, down from the peak but still up dramatically from the beginning of the year. And then, in the fall, it began rising again. This time, the rise was even more dramatic. By November 2013, Bitcoin crossed $1,000 for the first time. A week later, it reached $1,100. The media frenzy returned, more intense than before. Stories of Bitcoin millionaires filled the news. Ordinary people who had bought in early were featured in articles, their faces beaming, their fortunes made. Bitcoin was appearing in mainstream financial publications now, not just technology blogs. Investors were debating whether Bitcoin was a legitimate asset class or a bubble. Economists weighed in, some dismissing it as worthless. Others cautiously suggesting it might represent a real innovation in monetary technology. The Chinese market became particularly important in late 2013. Chinese exchanges reported enormous trading volumes, with Bitcoin becoming popular among Chinese citizens looking for ways to move money out of the country despite capital controls. The Chinese government's attitude toward Bitcoin was ambiguous, not explicitly banning it but not endorsing it either. This uncertainty allowed a grey market to flourish. Then, in December 2013, the Chinese government clarified its position. Banks and payment processors were prohibited from dealing with Bitcoin exchanges. The price, which had reached over $1,100, began to fall. Chinese exchanges saw their volume drop as it became harder for users to move money in and out. The price declined through December and into early 2014, sliding from the highs back down toward the $400 to $600 range. Another crash, another period of despair for those who had bought near the top. The pattern was becoming familiar. Dramatic rise fueled by enthusiasm and media attention. Peak, crash. Stabilization at a level higher than where the rise began, but well below the peak. But 2014 would bring a more serious crisis than just a price crash. It would bring the collapse of Mt. Gox, and with it a loss of confidence that would take years to rebuild. Mt. Gox had grown from a small exchange launched in 2010 to handling the majority of global Bitcoin trading by 2013. Its name was ODD, an acronym for Magic, the Gathering Online Exchange, because the website had originally been created to trade cards from the Magic game before being repurposed for Bitcoin. It was based in Tokyo, run by a French programmer named Marc Carpeles, who had acquired the company from its original founder. Through 2013, there had been warning signs that Mt. Gox was struggling. Withdrawals were sometimes delayed. Technical problems disrupted trading during high-volume periods. Customer service was poor, with users complaining of long delays in getting responses. But Mt. Gox was the biggest exchange, and many people assumed that meant it was trustworthy, that it had the resources and expertise to handle its business properly. In February 2014, Mt. Gox halted all withdrawals, claiming there was a technical issue that needed to be resolved. Days passed with no resolution. Users who had bitcoins or cash on the exchange couldn't access them. The Bitcoin community grew increasingly worried. Forum discussions filled with speculation about what was happening. Some people remained optimistic, believing it was truly just a technical glitch. Others feared something worse. On February 24, 2014, Mt. Gox went dark. The website went offline, the company's offices were emptied, and then the truth emerged. Mt. Gox had lost approximately 850,000 bitcoins belonging to users. At the time, this was worth about $450 million. The coins were simply gone. What had happened? The full story took time to piece together, and some details remain unclear. But it appeared that Mt. Gox had been hacked repeatedly over years, with bitcoin slowly stolen from its wallets without anyone noticing. The exchange had been poorly secured, with private keys stored in ways that left them vulnerable. Mark Karpeles had apparently not maintained proper accounting, not regularly verifying that the bitcoins customers believed they owned actually existed in Mt. Gox's wallets. By the time Mt. Gox finally checked, a huge portion of the bitcoins were missing. Rather than immediately disclosing this, the company had tried to continue operating, hoping to somehow recover the missing coins or make up the shortfall. This made the situation worse. More people deposited bitcoins and cash onto the exchange, not knowing they were essentially gone already. The Mt. Gox collapse was catastrophic for those who had funds on the exchange. People lost their life savings. Some users had 6-figure or even 7-figure amounts in bitcoins on Mt. Gox now gone. The bankruptcy proceedings would drag on for years, with users eventually recovering a small fraction of what they had lost. But for many, the damage was permanent and devastating. The broader Bitcoin community faced a crisis of confidence. Mt. Gox had been the most prominent Bitcoin exchange, and it had failed spectacularly. If Mt. Gox couldn't be trusted, which exchange could? How could Bitcoin grow and gain mainstream acceptance if the infrastructure around it was so fragile and prone to catastrophic failure? The price of Bitcoin fell to around $400 in the immediate aftermath of Mt. Gox's collapse. But actually it held up better than might have been expected. Some people thought the loss of 850,000 bitcoins would destroy Bitcoin entirely, that confidence would evaporate and the price would go to zero. The fact that it didn't, that Bitcoin continued to function despite the largest exchange failing and enormous amounts of coins being lost, suggested that Bitcoin itself was more resilient than the infrastructure built around it. The Mt. Gox collapse taught several harsh lessons. First, exchanges were a major point of vulnerability. They held users' bitcoins in centralized wallets, creating honeypots for hackers. If you wanted to steal a large amount of Bitcoin, attacking an exchange was far more efficient than attacking individual users. Second, the phrase "19" gained new urgency. People who had kept their bitcoins on Mt. Gox had trusted the exchange to hold them safely. That trust had been misplaced. The safer approach was to withdraw bitcoins from exchanges and store them in personal wallets where you controlled the private keys, even though this created other risks, like losing the keys if your computer crashed. Third, the lack of regulation and oversight in the Bitcoin ecosystem meant there was little protection for users when things went wrong. Traditional financial institutions had deposit insurance, regulatory audits, legal frameworks for bankruptcy and asset recovery. Bitcoin exchanges had none of this. You were on your own, trusting companies that often lacked the expertise or resources to properly secure hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency. Through 2014 and 2015, Bitcoin entered what people would later call the "20", a long period of declining prices and reduced enthusiasm. The price drifted down from around $400 to eventually reach a low of around $200 In early 2015, trading volume decreased, media attention faded, the speculative fervour that had characterised late 2013 was gone, replaced by a more subdued, almost defeated atmosphere. Many people who had bought Bitcoin during the 2013 boom sold during this decline, accepting losses and moving on. They decided Bitcoin had been a bubble, a fad, a foolish speculation. Better to cut losses and invest in something more stable and conventional. But others held on, or even bought more as the price fell. These were people who believed in Bitcoin's long-term potential, regardless of short-term price movements. They saw the crash and the crypto winter not as evidence that Bitcoin had failed, but as a necessary correction after unsustainable speculation. They believed that real value would be built during quiet periods when attention was low, when the people who remained were builders rather than speculators. This split between short-term traders and long-term holders, between those who saw Bitcoin as a speculation and those who saw it as a long-term investment or technological project, would continue to characterize the Bitcoin community. The traders chased price movements, buying on the way up and selling on the way down, or trying to time the market to buy low and sell high. The holders, often called hodlers in Bitcoin slang, after a misspelled forum post that became a meme, held through volatility because they believed the long-term trajectory was upward despite short-term chaos. There were stories from this period that illustrated both the tragedy and the hope. Stories of people who had lost fortunes on Mt. Gox, who were financially devastated, but who nevertheless continued to believe in Bitcoin and remained involved in the community. Stories of early adopters who had become fabulously wealthy during the 2013 boom and who used their wealth to fund Bitcoin infrastructure, development, and education. There were also stories of waste and excess. People who had made quick fortunes and spent them just as quickly on luxury goods, on parties, on ostentatious displays of wealth. And there were quieter stories of ordinary people who had made modest profits and used them for ordinary purposes, paying off student loans or making down payments on houses, or simply having a financial cushion they'd never had before. The Mt. Gox collapse and the subsequent price decline weeded out some of the more fragile participants. Exchanges that had security practices as poor as Mt. Goxes found themselves unable to attract users. Better-run exchanges emerged, implementing security measures like cold storage, where the majority of bitcoins were kept offline, and multi-signature wallets, where moving funds required multiple keys held by different people. Regulations began to develop as well. Governments in various countries started creating frameworks for how cryptocurrency exchanges should operate, what licenses they needed, what reporting requirements they had to meet. This was controversial in the Bitcoin community. Some people saw regulation as antithetical to Bitcoin's decentralized, permissionless ethos. Others recognized that some regulation might be necessary for mainstream adoption, that legitimate businesses and institutional investors wouldn't participate without clearer legal frameworks. Through all of this, the Bitcoin protocol itself continued to work as designed. Blocks were mined approximately every 10 minutes. Transactions were processed. The difficulty adjustment that regulated mining ensured that even as the total computing power of the network fluctuated, blocks continued to be produced at a steady rate. The blockchain grew longer, now containing years of transaction history, a permanent record that anyone could verify. Let that image settle, the blockchain growing quietly, steadily, regardless of price movements or exchange failures or media attention. It's a strange kind of stability, isn't it? The human systems built on top of Bitcoin were chaotic, fragile, prone to failure and fraud. But the underlying technology just kept working, maintained by miners scattered around the world who had economic incentives to keep the network running. Think about the person who bought Bitcoin at $1,000 in late 2013, watched it fall to $200, and had to decide whether to sell at a massive loss or hold and hope for recovery. Some people sold, unable to bear watching their investment decline further. Others held, either from conviction or from a kind of paralysis, unable to accept the loss by making it real through selling. Or think about the Mt. Gox victims, people who woke up one day to discover that hundreds or thousands or even millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin they thought they owned were simply gone. Some of these people gave up on cryptocurrency entirely, deciding the whole thing was too risky, too unstable, too prone to fraud. Others, remarkably, remained involved, viewing their loss as a painful lesson in security and custody, rather than as proof that Bitcoin itself was fundamentally flawed. The years 2013 and 2014 were a complete cycle. From boom to bust, from mainstream excitement to despair, from record highs to long decline. They established patterns that would repeat. The cycle of enthusiasm driving prices to unsustainable levels, the inevitable crash, the period of pessimism and consolidation, and then, eventually, the beginning of the next cycle. For Bitcoin to survive and eventually thrive, it needed to survive these cycles. It needed to prove that it could weather speculation and collapse, that the technology itself was robust enough to continue functioning, even when human enthusiasm waxed and waned. The 2013 to 2014 cycle suggested that it could, that Bitcoin was more than just a fad, that it had staying power even if its price didn't move in a straight line upward. The people who held through the crypto winter, who continued building and developing during the quiet years, would be vindicated later. But in 2014 and 2015, that vindication was far from certain. It was possible that Bitcoin had already seen its peak, that it would slowly fade into obscurity, becoming a footnote in the history of internet experiments that failed to achieve their potential. But it was also possible that the foundation was being laid for something more significant, that the lessons learned from Mt. Gox and other failures were making the ecosystem stronger, that each boom and bust cycle was bringing Bitcoin closer to mainstream acceptance, rather than further from it. The uncertainty was uncomfortable, but uncertainty is the nature of new technologies, of new financial systems, of anything that challenges established ways of doing things. Bitcoin was still an experiment, still a question rather than an answer. The experiment would continue, through quiet years and dramatic ones, through successes and failures, through the patient work of people who believed in something that most of the world still didn't understand or care about. Rest with that for a moment. The patience required to build something new, the resilience required to continue after catastrophic failure, the uncertainty of not knowing if your efforts will lead anywhere. We've all experienced some version of this, haven't we? Working on something difficult, not knowing if it will succeed, continuing anyway because the work itself feels important. Let your breathing slow. Let these details settle without needing to hold on to them. The story continues, but you can drift if you need to. The blockchain keeps growing whether anyone watches or not, whether anyone cares or not. There's something peaceful in that constancy, in systems that continue functioning regardless of human attention, will continue forward soon. While Bitcoin rested in the quiet years of 2014 and 2015, something else was building. A young programmer named Vitalik Buterin had been thinking about blockchain technology, about what else it could do beyond simple currency transactions. Vitalik had been involved in Bitcoin since 2011, writing for a publication called Bitcoin Magazine, thinking deeply about the technology's potential and limitations. Bitcoin's blockchain was designed for one primary purpose: recording transfers of value from one address to another. It did this job well, reliably, securely. But Vitalik wondered whether a blockchain could be more flexible, more programmable. What if instead of just recording simple transactions, a blockchain could execute arbitrary code, could run programs, could be a platform for building applications? In late 2013, Vitalik published a white paper proposing Ethereum, a new blockchain that would include a feature he called smart contracts. The idea of smart contracts wasn't entirely new. Nick Szabo had written about the concept in the 1990s. but Vitalik proposed actually implementing them on a blockchain, creating a system where contracts could be written in code and would execute automatically according to their programming, without requiring trust in any party to enforce them. Imagine a simple example. You and I make a bet about whether it will rain tomorrow. We each put $10 into a smart contract. The contract is programmed to check a weather data source tomorrow. If it rained, the contract automatically sends all $20 to you. If it didn't rain, it sends the money to me. No need for a trusted third party to hold the money and judge the outcome. No possibility of either of us refusing to pay when we lose. The code enforces the agreement. This was the vision. Smart contracts could handle not just bets, but any kind of agreement that could be reduced to code. Financial derivatives, insurance policies, property transfers, voting systems, supply chain tracking. The application seemed endless, limited only by imagination and programming skill. Vitalik and his co-founders raised money for Ethereum's development through a crowd sale in mid-2014, selling Ether tokens, Ethereum's native cryptocurrency, to fund the project. They raised about $18 million worth of Bitcoin, a substantial amount that would allow them to hire developers and build the system properly. Ethereum launched in July 2015. Like Bitcoin in its early days, it was experimental, uncertain, a technology looking for uses and users. The price of Ether started at a few dollars and fluctuated as people tried to understand what this new platform could do. The community that formed around Ethereum was different from Bitcoin's community in some ways. Bitcoin attracted people interested in alternative currency, in financial sovereignty, in getting away from government control of money. Ethereum attracted developers who wanted to build decentralized applications, entrepreneurs who saw business opportunities in smart contracts, and enthusiasts who believed that blockchain technology could revolutionize not just money, but many other industries. But Ethereum would face its own crisis early on, a crisis that would raise fundamental questions about how blockchain systems should respond to catastrophic failures. In April 2016, a group launched something called the DAO. DAO stood for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and the concept was ambitious. Imagine an investment fund with no managers, no board of directors, no company structure at all. Just code. The DAO would raise money by selling tokens. Token holders could vote on which projects to fund. The projects would be executed automatically by smart contracts. It would be completely transparent, completely decentralized, governed by rules written in code rather than by human discretion. The DAO's crowd sale was enormously successful, raising about $150 million worth of Ether, making it one of the largest crowdfunding campaigns in history at the time. The community was excited. This seemed to be proof that Ethereum's vision of programmable blockchain technology could work, that people were willing to trust code to manage large amounts of money. But in June 2016, disaster struck. Someone found a vulnerability in the DAO's code, a subtle bug that allowed them to drain funds from the contract. Over several hours, the attacker siphoned off about 1/3 of the DAO's total Ether, approximately $50 million worth. The attack was visible on the blockchain as it happened, but the decentralized nature of the system meant there was no authority who could stop it, no central bank to freeze the transaction, no way to reverse what was occurring. The Ethereum community faced a profound dilemma. The attacker had exploited a bug in the code, but they hadn't hacked the Ethereum network itself. They had simply found a flaw in the DAO's smart contract and used it. In a sense, they were following the rules as written in the code. One of the principles of smart contracts was supposed to be quote 22, the idea that the code itself defines what's permitted and what's not, that if the code allows something, even unintentionally, then it's technically legitimate. But letting the attacker keep $50 million worth of stolen funds seemed intolerable. The people who had invested in the DAO would lose their money through no fault of their own, just because the developers had made a subtle programming error. This would devastate confidence in Ethereum and smart contracts generally. It might kill the platform before it really had a chance to develop, so the Ethereum community debated what to do. One option was a hard fork, a change to the Ethereum protocol that would essentially rewrite history, undoing the theft by reverting the blockchain to a state before the attack occurred. The stolen ether would be returned to the DAO investors, as if the attack had never happened. This was technically possible. Ethereum, like Bitcoin, was open-source software that could be modified if enough people agreed to run the new version. But it was philosophically troubling. If the blockchain could be rewritten to fix this problem, couldn't it be rewritten to fix other problems? Couldn't it be rewritten to reverse any transaction that people decided was illegitimate? And if that was possible, then in what sense was Ethereum immutable, decentralized, trustless? The debate was intense. Some people argued passionately that the hard fork was necessary, that saving the DAO investors was more important than abstract principles about immutability. The attacker had clearly acted in bad faith, exploiting a bug rather than using the DAO as intended. Reversing the theft was the right thing to do. Others argued just as passionately against the hard fork. They said that blockchains must be immutable, that if we start rewriting history when we don't like the outcome, we've abandoned the core principle that makes blockchain technology valuable. Code is law, they insisted. If the DAO's code was flawed, that was unfortunate, but the solution was to write better code in the future, not to rewrite the past. After weeks of debate and a community vote, the Ethereum developers implemented the hard fork in July 2016. The majority of the community upgraded to the new version of the software, which reversed the theft and returned the funds. This version of Ethereum continued as the main chain, the one that kept the Ethereum name and ticker symbol. But a minority refused to upgrade. They continued running the old software, the version where the theft had occurred and stood unreversed. This became a separate blockchain called Ethereum Classic, operating on the principle that code is law and immutability is paramount, even when the results are unpleasant. So now there were two Ethereums. Ethereum, the forked version that had reversed the theft, and Ethereum Classic, the original chain that hadn't. Both blockchains shared history up until the fork point, but from July 2016 forward they diverged, processing different transactions, developing in different directions. This split was contentious and somewhat painful for the community. People who had been working together suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a philosophical divide. The Ethereum side believed they'd made the pragmatic moral choice to help victims of theft. The Ethereum Classic side believed they'd upheld principle against pressure to compromise for convenience. Both chains survived, though Ethereum, with the majority of developers and users, remained far more prominent and valuable. The DAO hack and the resulting hard fork became a defining moment for Ethereum, teaching lessons about the complexity of smart contract security and the challenges of governance in decentralized systems. The incident revealed that code is law was more complicated than it seemed. Code written by humans contains bugs. Smart contracts that handle millions of dollars need to be audited carefully, tested extensively. Because once deployed to the blockchain, they're difficult or impossible to change. The permanence that made blockchain valuable also made mistakes permanent. But the hard fork showed that communities could make collective decisions to override code when circumstances were extreme enough. Whether this was a feature or a bug depended on your perspective. It meant the system had some flexibility to respond to catastrophic events. It also meant the system wasn't as immutable or uncensorable as proponents sometimes claimed. Through late 2016 and into 2017, Ethereum continued to develop despite the DAO crisis, or perhaps because of it. The crisis had revealed problems but also demonstrated that the community could respond to problems, could make difficult decisions, could survive controversy and keep building. Developers began creating applications on Ethereum. Some were experimental, testing what was possible with smart contracts. Others were more ambitious, trying to build actual businesses and services. The vision was decentralized applications, programs that ran on the Ethereum blockchain rather than on centralized servers, that couldn't be shut down by any authority, that operated transparently according to their code. The concept of tokens on Ethereum also developed during this period. Using Ethereum's smart contract capabilities, anyone could create their own cryptocurrency token. These tokens could represent anything: shares in a project, points in a game, rights to a service, membership in an organization. Creating a token was much easier than creating a new blockchain from scratch the way Bitcoin or Ethereum had done. You just wrote a smart contract that kept track of token balances and transfers. This token functionality would lead to significant developments in 2017, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In late 2016, Ethereum was still relatively quiet, working through the implications of the DAO crisis, building infrastructure, attracting developers who saw potential in programmable blockchain technology. Meanwhile, Bitcoin was also evolving through this period, though in different ways. The Bitcoin community was engaged in its own contentious debates, primarily about how to scale the network to handle more transactions. Bitcoin's blocks were limited in size, which meant they could only contain a limited number of transactions. As Bitcoin usage grew, blocks were filling up, causing transaction fees to rise and confirmation times to increase. Various solutions were proposed. Some people wanted to increase the block size, allowing more transactions per block. Others wanted to implement more complex technical solutions that would allow transactions to be processed off the main blockchain and only settled on the blockchain periodically. These debates became quite heated, with different factions accusing each other of trying to destroy Bitcoin or betray its principles. The Bitcoin scaling debate revealed a challenge inherent in decentralized systems. How do you make decisions when there's no central authority? Bitcoin and Ethereum both struggled with this. Changes to the protocol required consensus, but different people had different ideas about what changes were necessary or desirable. The openness and decentralization that made these systems resistant to control also made them difficult to upgrade or improve, but the blockchain communities were learning, adapting, developing norms and processes for handling disagreements. They were discovering that decentralized governance was possible but messy, that it required patience and compromise, that sometimes communities would split when disagreements were too deep to resolve. Other cryptocurrencies were emerging during this period as well. Litecoin, which had launched in 2011 as a faster alternative to Bitcoin. Ripple, focused on bank payments. Monero, emphasizing privacy and anonymity. Dash, Zcash, and others, each trying to improve on Bitcoin or Ethereum in some way, each attracting their own communities and use cases. The cryptocurrency ecosystem was diversifying. Instead of just Bitcoin, there were now dozens and then hundreds of different cryptocurrencies, each with different features, different philosophies, different goals. Some people saw this as positive, as experimentation that would reveal what worked and what didn't. Others saw it as fragmentation, as dilution of effort and attention that would prevent any single cryptocurrency from achieving the scale necessary for mainstream success. Through 2015 and 2016, the crypto winter was slowly ending. Bitcoin's price stabilized and then began to climb gradually from around $250 to $400, then to $600. Ethereum's price rose as well as the platform attracted more developers and users. The bear market seemed to be over. The question was whether this was the beginning of another bubble or the start of more sustainable growth. Let's pause here and think about what had been learned during these wilderness years. The period from 2014 through 2016 wasn't exciting in the way that 2013's boom had been. There were no dramatic price movements that made headlines. The media attention had faded. To casual observers, cryptocurrency might have seemed like a failed experiment, a fad that had come and gone. But for those who stayed involved, these were productive years. Infrastructure improved. Exchanges became more secure, implementing better practices after the Mt. Gox disaster. Wallet software became easier to use, regulatory frameworks began to develop, providing more clarity about how cryptocurrencies fit into existing legal and financial systems. Developers built during this time, creating tools and applications without the distraction of speculation and hype. The technology matured. Ethereum introduced smart contracts, expanding what blockchain could do beyond simple currency. Other projects explored different approaches to consensus, to privacy, to scalability. Philosophical questions that would continue to shape cryptocurrency development were being articulated and debated. Questions about immutability versus flexibility. As the Ethereum hard fork demonstrated, questions about scaling and maintaining decentralization, questions about governance and how decentralized communities make collective decisions, questions about whether cryptocurrency should focus on being money or whether it should be a platform for broader applications. These weren't just abstract debates. They had practical implications for how the technology developed, for what it could and couldn't do, for who would use it and why. The answers weren't always clear. Often different projects made different choices, and only time would reveal which choices worked better. Think about Vitalik Buterin, still in his early 20s, proposing Ethereum and then dealing with the DAO crisis just a year after the platform launched. The weight of deciding whether to hard fork, whether to rewrite blockchain history to fix a catastrophic bug. The responsibility of building a platform that would handle billions of dollars of value, where mistakes in code could lead to permanent loss of funds. Or think about the smaller developers and community members, working for modest pay or for free, building infrastructure and applications because they believed in the technology's potential, writing documentation, answering questions from newcomers, fixing bugs, proposing improvements. The patient, unglamorous work of building that happens away from headlines and price charts. Or consider the early adopters who held through the crypto winter, who watched their Bitcoin or Ethereum holdings lose 70 or 80% of their peak value and decided to hold anyway, or even to buy more. They faced ridicule from friends and family who saw cryptocurrency as a failed investment. They faced their own doubts, wondering if they were being stubborn rather than wise, but they held on, maintaining conviction when it was difficult to do so. The years 2014 through 2016 were a test. They tested whether cryptocurrency could survive without the excitement of a bull market. They tested whether the technology was robust enough to continue functioning through crises like Mt. Gox and the DAO. They tested whether communities could govern themselves, could make difficult decisions, could survive disagreement and controversy. Cryptocurrency passed these tests, not perfectly, but well enough to survive. The fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum continue to exist, continue to process transactions, continue to attract developers and users even during the quiet years, suggested that there was something real underneath the speculation, something more substantial than just hype and price movement. The blockchain kept growing, of course. Bitcoin's blockchain, Ethereum's blockchain, other blockchains, all continuing to record transactions block after block, day after day, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. There's something meditative about that, isn't there? Systems continuing to function, doing their job, maintaining their integrity, independent of human excitement or disappointment. Let your breathing match that rhythm, steady, consistent. Each breath like a block being added to a chain, connecting to what came before, building something that grows slowly but reliably. There's no rush, no need to understand everything all at once. Just let the information settle, let the patterns emerge gradually. The story continues, building toward the next great wave of enthusiasm and excess that would arrive in 2017. But for now, rest in these quiet years, in the patient work of building, in the unglamorous but essential task of learning from failure and creating better systems. We'll continue shortly. For now, just breathe. Let yourself drift if you need to. The blockchain will keep growing whether you watch or not, whether you understand completely or not. That's part of its beauty, that constancy, that reliability, that persistence through both excitement and neglect. The year 2017 arrived with cryptocurrency prices rising steadily but not dramatically. Bitcoin started the year around $1,000, roughly where it had peaked briefly in late 2013 before the long decline. Ethereum was trading around $8. These were respectable prices, representing substantial gains from the lows of 2015, but nothing that would attract mainstream attention. Then something shifted. The slow, steady climb became steeper. By March, Bitcoin crossed $1,500. By May, $2,000. The media began to notice again, running stories about Bitcoin's return, about whether this time was different, about whether the cryptocurrency that had seemed dead in 2015 was actually coming back to life. But this was just the beginning. Through the summer and fall of 2017, Bitcoin's price accelerated upward in a way that made the 2013 boom look restrained by comparison. $3,000 in June, $4,000 in August, $5,000 in October. Each milestone that once would have seemed impossible was reached, and then surpassed within weeks. Ethereum rose even more dramatically in percentage terms. From $8 at the start of the year, it reached $50 in March, $100 in May, and peaked around $400 in June before pulling back. The entire cryptocurrency market was caught in the updraft, with hundreds of different coins and tokens all rising together. What was driving this extraordinary surge? There were several factors, feeding off each other in a self-reinforcing cycle. Institutional interest was growing, with more hedge funds and investment firms taking cryptocurrency seriously, allocating portions of their portfolios to Bitcoin and Ethereum. Retail investors were flooding in, opening accounts on exchanges like Coinbase, buying cryptocurrency for the first time. The media coverage intensified with each price milestone, creating awareness that led to more people buying, which drove prices higher, which generated more coverage. Cryptocurrency became a topic of conversation at dinner tables, at offices, at family gatherings. Everyone seemed to know someone who was making money with Bitcoin, or claimed to be. But perhaps the most significant driver of the 2017 boom was something that hadn't existed during the 2013 boom: initial coin offerings, or ICOs. These were crowdfunding campaigns where new cryptocurrency projects would create tokens on the Ethereum blockchain and sell them to raise money. It was similar to a stock initial public offering, but with far less regulation and far lower barriers to entry. The ICO model was simple and powerful. A team would publish a white paper describing their project, create a token, and announce a crowd sale. People would send Ethereum or Bitcoin and in return receive the new tokens. The tokens might represent shares in the project, or rights to use a future service, or simply speculative assets that could be traded. Often the details were vague. The projects were early stage or even purely conceptual, but that didn't seem to matter. Successful ICOs raised millions of dollars, sometimes tens of millions, sometimes in a matter of minutes. The Brave browser's ICO raised $35 million in 30 seconds. Bancor raised $153 million in 3 hours. Filecoin raised $257 million. The amounts were staggering, and the ease with which projects could raise money was unprecedented. This created a gold rush mentality. It seemed like every technology project was launching an ICO, creating a token, trying to raise money through cryptocurrency rather than through traditional venture capital. The tokens were then listed on exchanges where they could be traded, often at prices higher than the ICO sale price, allowing early buyers to make quick profits. This in turn created demand for Ethereum, because most ICOs were conducted on the Ethereum blockchain and required participants to send Ethereum to participate. People bought Ethereum not because they wanted to use it or hold it long term, but because they needed it to participate in ICOs. This drove Ethereum's price up, which made people who held Ethereum wealthier, which increased the general sense that everyone in cryptocurrency was getting rich. The psychology of the boom was fascinating and troubling. There was a genuine fear of missing out, often abbreviated as FOMO. People watched cryptocurrency prices rise day after day, watched their friends and co-workers talk about their gains, and felt intense pressure to get involved. What if this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? What if they missed out on the chance to make life-changing money because they were too cautious? This fear was powerful enough to overcome normal risk aversion. People who would never invest their savings in a speculative asset suddenly found themselves buying Bitcoin or Ethereum or various ICO tokens. The thinking went, yes, it's risky, but the potential upside is so enormous that even a small investment could pay off tremendously. And besides, everyone else is doing it and making money, so how risky can it really be? The conversation at Thanksgiving dinners in late 2017 became legendary in cryptocurrency lore. Families gathered for the holiday, and inevitably the topic of Bitcoin came up. The young person who had bought Bitcoin years ago would be fielding questions from uncles and cousins and grandparents who wanted to know how to buy it, whether it was too late to get in, what other cryptocurrencies they should buy. This phenomenon, sometimes called Quote 24, was both amusing and concerning. Amusing because it showed how thoroughly cryptocurrency had penetrated mainstream awareness. Concerning because when your relatives who know nothing about finance or technology are asking how to buy Bitcoin, that's often a sign that a market is overheated, that speculation has reached unsustainable levels. By November 2017, Bitcoin crossed $10,000. By early December, $15,000. The price was rising so fast that it was hard to keep track, hard to process what was happening. On December 17th, Bitcoin reached its peak for that cycle, $19,783, depending on which exchange you looked at. Some exchanges showed prices above $20,000. Think about what this meant. Someone who had bought one Bitcoin at the beginning of the year for $1,000 now held an asset worth nearly $20,000. A 20-fold gain in less than 12 months. Someone who had bought Bitcoin during the 2015 lows at $200 had seen their investment increase 100-fold. And someone who had bought during Bitcoin's early years, when it cost pennies, was sitting on gains that seemed almost incomprehensible. The media coverage during the December peak was frenzied. Financial news channels devoted significant airtime to cryptocurrency. Bitcoin was discussed on morning shows, evening news, talk shows. Everyone had an opinion. Some commentators called it the greatest investment opportunity of the generation. Others called it a bubble destined to burst spectacularly. Cryptocurrency conferences were packed with thousands of attendees. Luxury hotels hosted blockchain summits where tickets cost thousands of dollars. The mood at these events was euphoric, almost manic. People traded tips about which ICO to invest in next, which cryptocurrency was about to quote 25 slang for experiencing dramatic price increases. There were stories of instant wealth, of people becoming millionaires, of Lamborghinis being bought with Bitcoin profits. The Lamborghini became a symbol of cryptocurrency wealth, referenced so often that quote 26 quote became a meme. A joking question about when cryptocurrency gains would be large enough to buy a Lamborghini. Some cryptocurrency enthusiasts really did buy Lamborghinis and posted photos online, reinforcing the narrative that extraordinary wealth was available to anyone willing to take the risk. But underneath the euphoria, there were warning signs for those paying attention. Many of the ICOs were clearly fraudulent or, at best, wildly unrealistic. White papers promised to revolutionize industries using blockchain technology. But often the problems being solved were either trivial or didn't actually require blockchain. The teams behind many projects had no relevant experience. Their business models made no sense. It didn't matter. As long as prices kept rising, as long as ICO tokens could be sold on exchanges for more than the purchase price, People kept buying. The greater fool theory was in full effect. You might know that a token was overvalued or that a project would probably fail, but if you believed you could sell it to someone else at a higher price before it collapsed, you could still make money. This created an ecosystem rife with fraud and manipulation. Promoters, sometimes celebrities or social media influencers, would be paid to endorse ICOs without disclosing their compensation. Pump and dump schemes flourished, where groups would coordinate buying a low-volume cryptocurrency to drive up the price, then sell once others bought in at the higher price, leaving latecomers with losses. Fake exchanges, fake wallets, fake investment schemes, all designed to separate excited but naive investors from their money. The regulatory environment was confused and inadequate. The SEC and other regulatory bodies were starting to pay attention, issuing warnings that many ICOs were actually unregistered securities offerings. But enforcement was slow and inconsistent. Different countries took different approaches. China banned ICOs and cryptocurrency exchanges entirely in September 2017. South Korea considered similar measures. Other countries took a more permissive stance, or simply hadn't yet formulated coherent policies. As December turned to January 2018, the market reached a kind of fever pitch. Bitcoin wasn't the only cryptocurrency at all-time highs. Ethereum had recovered from its mid-year pullback and reached around $1,400. Ripple, a cryptocurrency focused on bank payments, briefly became the second largest cryptocurrency by market value, with its price rising from less than 1 cent at the start of 2017 to over $3 at the peak. Smaller cryptocurrencies, often called altcoins, experienced even more dramatic gains. Coins that had been worth fractions of a cent rose to dollars or tens of dollars. Some people made fortunes by buying obscure altcoins early and selling near the peak. Others lost fortunes by buying those same coins after the peak, watching them fall 95 or even 99% from their highs. The total cryptocurrency market capitalization, the combined value of all cryptocurrencies, reached over $800 billion in early January 2018. This represented an increase from about $18 billion at the start of 2017. The growth was exponential, parabolic, unsustainable, and then, as had happened before, the market turned. Bitcoin's price began to decline from its December highs. At first, this seemed like a normal correction, a brief pullback before another surge upward, but the decline continued. $20,000 became $15,000, then $12,000, then $10,000. The altcoins fell harder and faster. Many lost 50% of their value within days. The ICO tokens that had seemed like sure winners just weeks earlier were suddenly dropping precipitously. Ethereum fell from its peak, declining back toward the $400 to $600 range. The psychology flipped. Fear of missing out became fear of losing everything. People who had bought near the top watched their investments evaporate. The certainty that prices would keep rising forever was replaced by panic and despair. Forums that had been filled with celebration became filled with questions about whether to sell and cut losses or hold and hope for recovery. By February 2018, Bitcoin had fallen to around $6,000, down about 70% from its peak. It would continue to decline through the year, eventually bottoming around $3,000 in December 2018, an 85% drop from the high. Ethereum fell from $1,400 to as low as $80, a decline of over 94%. Many altcoins lost 99% of their value, or simply ceased to exist. Their developers abandoning the projects, their communities evaporating. The crash was brutal, especially for those who had bought near the top. Stories emerged of people who had invested their life savings, who had taken out loans to buy cryptocurrency, who had mortgaged their homes or withdrawn their retirement accounts. For these people, the crash wasn't just disappointing. It was financially devastating, potentially life-ruining. The media narrative shifted as well. Where cryptocurrency had been portrayed as the future of money just weeks earlier, it was now portrayed as a cautionary tale, a bubble that had predictably burst. A mania that had separated fools from their money. The same commentators who had enthusiastically discussed cryptocurrency in December were now explaining why they had always known it would crash. For the cryptocurrency community, this crash was more severe than 2014's decline in some ways. More people had been involved, more money had been lost, the heights had been higher, so the fall was farther. The disappointment was sharper because the peak had seemed so close to mainstream breakthrough, to cryptocurrency becoming a normal part of the financial system. But in other ways, the pattern was familiar. Bitcoin and the broader cryptocurrency market had experienced boom and bust before. The 2013 cycle had followed a similar trajectory: dramatic rise, peak, crash, long decline. Those who had lived through that earlier cycle recognized the pattern and knew that crashes, however severe, didn't necessarily mean the end. Let that settle for a moment. The cycle completing itself again, larger this time, more dramatic, involving more people and more money, but fundamentally similar. Enthusiasm building on itself until it reached unsustainable levels. The inevitable correction. The long, painful decline as reality reasserted itself and the gap between price and fundamental value closed. Think about the person who bought Bitcoin at $19,000, perhaps in December 2017, perhaps believing they were getting in on the future of finance, perhaps encouraged by friends or family or media coverage suggesting this was a historic opportunity. They watched their investment lose half its value in weeks, then 3/4, then more. Some held, believing or hoping it would recover. Others sold at massive losses, deciding to get out before losing everything. Or think about the ICO investors who sent Ethereum to projects with glossy white papers and impressive websites but little substance. Many of those projects delivered nothing, or delivered something that was immediately irrelevant. The tokens became worthless. The money was gone, spent by teams that had raised millions with little accountability. There were also those who timed it well, who sold near the top, who made substantial profits and got out before the crash. Some of these people were lucky. Others were disciplined, setting price targets and sticking to them. Either way, their success stories coexisted with many more stories of loss and disappointment. The 2017 boom and 2018 bust became a defining moment in cryptocurrency history. It demonstrated that cryptocurrency could capture mainstream attention, could become a cultural phenomenon, could seem briefly like the most important financial development of the era. But it also demonstrated that the infrastructure wasn't ready, that speculation far exceeded utility, that regulatory frameworks were inadequate, that the technology still faced fundamental challenges around scalability, security, and usability. The boom attracted millions of new people to cryptocurrency, many of whom stuck around even after the crash, learning about the technology, becoming part of the community. But it also created a large population of people who tried cryptocurrency once, lost money, and concluded it was a scam or a bubble and wanted nothing more to do with it. The ICO boom left behind some legitimate projects that continued building through the subsequent bear market. But it also left behind a graveyard of failed projects, a lingering association between cryptocurrency and fraud, and heightened regulatory scrutiny that would shape how future cryptocurrency projects could raise money and operate. In the immediate aftermath, in early 2018, the mood in the cryptocurrency community was somber. The party was over. The prices were crashing. The mainstream attention was fading, replaced by mockery and I told you so commentary. It was unclear whether cryptocurrency would recover, whether the 2017 peak would stand as the all-time high, whether the whole thing would slowly fade into irrelevance. But the blockchain kept running, of course. Bitcoin blocks were still being mined every 10 minutes. Ethereum was still processing transactions. The technology continued to function regardless of price, regardless of sentiment, maintained by miners and validators who had economic incentives to keep the network running even during bear markets. Some people left the space entirely during the crash. Others, particularly those who'd been involved before 2017 and had seen boom and bust cycles before, recognized this as the natural rhythm of cryptocurrency markets. They knew that after the crash would come a period of quiet building, of weeding out the fraudulent projects and speculative excess, of strengthening infrastructure and developing real use cases. And they believed, though they couldn't be certain, that after the winter would come another spring, another cycle. The question of whether cryptocurrency had any real value beyond speculation remained contested. Critics pointed to the boom and bust as evidence that cryptocurrency was purely a speculative bubble, that it had no fundamental value, that it would eventually go to zero. Supporters argued that the technology was sound, that the speculation was a distraction from the real work of building decentralized systems, that over time utility would emerge and justify higher valuations. Both sides had points. Cryptocurrency had certainly attracted far more speculation than genuine use. Most people who bought Bitcoin or Ethereum in 2017 were not using it as currency or as a platform for applications. They were buying it hoping the price would rise so they could sell at a profit. In that sense, the critics were right that speculation dominated. But it was also true that the underlying technology kept improving, that developers kept building, that some legitimate use cases were emerging. International remittances, providing financial services to people without access to traditional banking, censorship-resistant donations to activists and dissidents. These were real applications that cryptocurrency enabled, even if they were small in scale compared to the speculation. The boom and bust of 2017 and 2018 was in some ways a necessary chapter in cryptocurrency's evolution. It brought attention, attracted talent and capital, stress-tested the systems at scale, revealed weaknesses that needed to be addressed. It was painful, particularly for those who lost money. But it was also educational, providing lessons about what worked and what didn't, what was sustainable and what was merely hype. As 2018 progressed and the prices continued declining, as projects shut down and exchanges failed, and the media lost interest, the people who remained in cryptocurrency entered another crypto winter, longer and colder than the one from 2014 to 2016. This time they knew what to expect. This time they understood that patience would be required, that rebuilding would take time, that the next cycle, if it came, might be years away. Let yourself rest with that image. The winter settling in, the excitement fading, prices falling steadily, relentlessly, day after day, month after month, and through it all, the quiet work continuing, developers coding, miners mining, believers holding, waiting for spring, not knowing when or if it would come, but waiting nonetheless. Your breathing can slow to match that patience, that long quiet waiting. No urgency, no rush, just the steady continuation of work and time, of systems running and seasons changing, of winters that eventually, always, give way to spring, though the timing remains uncertain and the arrival feels distant when you're deep in the cold. We'll continue shortly. For now, just rest in the quiet after the storm, in the settling after the frenzy, in the long breath out after the peak. The winter of 2018 settled in with a familiar cold. Bitcoin's price drifted down through the year, testing support levels that had seemed solid, then breaking through them, finding new lows. $6,000 became $5,000, then $4,000, then $3,000 by December. Each decline brought fresh pessimism, fresh articles declaring cryptocurrency dead, fresh exits by people who had finally had enough. The ICO market, which had seemed so vibrant and promising in 2017, collapsed almost entirely. Regulatory scrutiny had increased, with the SEC making clear that most token sales were actually securities offerings and required proper registration. The easy money of the boom was gone. Projects that had raised millions found themselves unable to deliver on their promises, unable to sustain development, unable to maintain the enthusiasm that had driven their initial success. Many projects simply disappeared. Websites went dark. Telegram channels fell silent. The teams stopped communicating with their communities, stopped updating their code repositories, stopped pretending they were still working toward their stated goals. The tokens these projects had sold became worthless, sometimes literally untradeable, because no exchange would list them, sometimes trading for fractions of a penny. For investors who had participated in ICOs during the boom, this was a bitter lesson. The white papers that had seemed so impressive, the teams that had seemed so credible, the visions that had seemed so compelling, most of it had been smoke and mirrors, optimism without substance, promises that were never intended to be kept or were simply impossible to fulfill. But not all projects disappeared. Some teams, the ones who had been serious about building from the start, continued working through the winter. They had raised money during the boom, yes, but they used that money to hire developers, to build products, to solve technical problems. The crash didn't change their fundamental mission. It just meant they worked with less attention, less hype, less pressure to deliver immediate returns to token holders. The cryptocurrency community that remained after the crash was different from the one that had existed during the boom. Smaller, certainly, more technical, more focused on building than on speculation. The people who stayed were either true believers in the technology, developers who found the problems interesting regardless of price, or long-term holders who had seen boom and bust cycles before and knew that winters eventually ended. The phrase that emerged during this period was, quote, 27. The idea was that real progress happened when attention was low, when the speculators had left, when teams could focus on solving hard problems rather than marketing and hype. The survivors of previous crypto winters became almost proud of their patience, of their willingness to keep working when prices were down and enthusiasm was gone. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the institutional world. While retail investors were nursing losses and swearing off cryptocurrency, some large financial institutions were quietly building infrastructure and exploring how to offer cryptocurrency services to their clients. Fidelity Investments, one of the largest asset managers in the world, announced Fidelity Digital Assets in October 2018, a service to provide custody and trade execution for cryptocurrency to institutional investors. This was significant. Fidelity was a mainstream trusted financial institution with trillions of dollars under management. Their entry into cryptocurrency lending suggested that at least some traditional finance firms saw long-term potential despite the current bear market. Bakkt, a cryptocurrency platform backed by the New York Stock Exchange's parent company, was working toward launch, planning to offer Bitcoin futures and custody services. Again, this represented traditional finance taking cryptocurrency seriously, building infrastructure even while prices were declining. The institutional interest was driven partly by recognition that cryptocurrency wasn't going away despite the crash. Bitcoin had survived multiple boom and bust cycles, the technology continued to function, and some institutional investors believed that cryptocurrency might eventually become an established asset class. That getting infrastructure in place during the bear market would position them well for the next cycle. But institutional adoption was proceeding slowly and carefully. These weren't the reckless ICO investors of 2017. These were conservative financial institutions that moved deliberately, that needed regulatory clarity, that required robust security and compliance systems. The infrastructure they were building in 2018 and 2019 wouldn't show its full impact for years. The regulatory environment was also evolving during this period. Different jurisdictions were developing different approaches. Some countries like China maintained hard bans on cryptocurrency trading, and ICOs. Others, like Switzerland and Singapore, created relatively friendly regulatory frameworks designed to encourage blockchain innovation while preventing fraud. The United States remained somewhat ambiguous. The SEC was clear that many tokens were securities and required registration. The CFTC treated Bitcoin and Ethereum as commodities. State regulators had varying requirements. This patchwork of regulations created confusion, but also space for innovation. As projects navigated the complex landscape trying to build compliant businesses, in June 2019, Facebook announced Libra, a cryptocurrency project that aimed to create a global digital currency backed by a basket of real-world currencies and operated by a consortium of major companies. The announcement generated enormous attention and enormous pushback. Regulators immediately raised concerns about a company with billions of users creating its own currency. Politicians held hearings. Facebook's partners began dropping out of the consortium. Libra, which would eventually be renamed Diem and then shut down without ever launching, represented something interesting about cryptocurrency's position by 2019. The technology was credible enough that Facebook thought it worth pursuing, but the regulatory and political obstacles were significant enough to prevent even Facebook, one of the most powerful companies in the world, from successfully launching a cryptocurrency. The Libra announcement did have one effect. It focused governmental attention on cryptocurrency, and particularly on the idea of stablecoins, cryptocurrencies designed to maintain a stable value by being backed by reserves of traditional currency. Stablecoins had existed for years, most notably Tether, which claimed to be backed one-to-one by US dollar reserves. Though the transparency of those reserves was controversial, stablecoins were becoming important infrastructure in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. They allowed traders to move money between cryptocurrencies without converting back to dollars and dealing with the banking system. They provided a stable store of value within cryptocurrency exchanges and wallets, and they hinted at what a widely adopted cryptocurrency might look like. Not a volatile, speculative asset like Bitcoin, but a stable medium of exchange that combined cryptocurrency's benefits with traditional currency's stability. Alongside stablecoins, another development was quietly building through 2018 and 2019, decentralized finance, or DeFi. This was a movement to recreate traditional financial services, lending, borrowing, trading, insurance, using smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain rather than centralized institutions. The idea was compelling. Imagine being able to take out a loan without a bank, just by depositing cryptocurrency as collateral into a smart contract that would automatically liquidate the collateral if you didn't repay. Or imagine earning interest on your cryptocurrency by lending it through a decentralized protocol rather than keeping it idle in a wallet. Or trading one cryptocurrency for another without using a centralized exchange, just by interacting with a smart contract that automated the process. Early DeFi protocols like MakerDAO, which created the Day stablecoin, and Compound, which offered cryptocurrency lending and borrowing, launched during this period. The amounts of money involved were still small by traditional finance standards, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars rather than trillions. But the concept was being proven. Financial services could be provided in a decentralized, programmable way. DeFi remained niche through 2019, known mainly to cryptocurrency enthusiasts and developers. But it was laying groundwork for what would become a major narrative in the next cycle. The idea that blockchain technology could not just create new currencies, but could reconstruct the entire financial system in a decentralized, open, programmable form. The Bitcoin network itself was also evolving through this period. The scaling debates that had raged in 2016 and 2017 led to a fork in August 2017, with Bitcoin Cash splitting off as a separate cryptocurrency that had larger block sizes. Bitcoin itself implemented SegWit, a technical upgrade that effectively increased capacity, and the Lightning Network, a Layer 2 solution that allowed transactions to happen off the main blockchain, and then be settled on-chain later, began to develop. These technical improvements were important but unglamorous. They didn't generate excitement the way price increases did, but they represented the patient work of making the technology more useful, more scalable, more capable of handling mainstream adoption if and when that arrived. Ethereum was preparing for its own major upgrade, planning to transition from proof of work, where miners competed to solve cryptographic puzzles, to proof of stake, where validators would be selected to create blocks based on how much ether they held and were willing to lock up as security. This transition, called Ethereum 2.0, would take years to implement fully, but the planning and early development work happened during the crypto winter. Through all of this, the price remained stubbornly low. Bitcoin bounced around in the $3,000 to $4,000 range through early 2019, occasionally spiking higher but always falling back. Ethereum traded between $80 and $200. The altcoins that hadn't disappeared entirely traded at tiny fractions of their all-time highs. For people holding cryptocurrency through this period, it required genuine conviction, or perhaps stubbornness. Every day brought new reasons to doubt. The prices weren't recovering. Many projects had failed. Regulatory pressure was increasing. Mainstream adoption seemed as distant as ever. Why continue holding an asset that had lost 70 or 80 or 90% of its value and showed no signs of recovering? Some people did sell, deciding to cut their losses and move on. Others held because they believed in the long-term vision, because they thought cryptocurrency represented a genuine innovation that would eventually be recognized and valued properly. And some held simply because their losses were so large that selling would make them real, would force them to admit defeat, and it felt better to hold and hope than to accept the loss. The psychology of holding through a bear market is interesting and complex. There's the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because you've already invested so much, even when the rational choice would be to cut losses. There's the narrative you tell yourself about why the asset will recover, about why this time the market is wrong and you are right. There's the selective attention to positive news and dismissal of negative news. But there's also, for some holders, a genuine understanding of market cycles, a recognition that assets don't move in straight lines, that periods of decline are natural and necessary, that patience is rewarded in the long run. These holders had often been through previous cycles. They remembered that Bitcoin had crashed before and recovered. They believed it would happen again. In the broader culture, cryptocurrency had largely faded from consciousness by late 2018 and 2019. It wasn't a topic of conversation anymore. The media had moved on to other stories. The speculative enthusiasm that had made cryptocurrency a cultural phenomenon in late 2017 was completely gone. This obscurity was, in some ways, healthy for the space. It removed the pressure to perform for an audience. It allowed development to happen without the distraction of constant price speculation and media scrutiny. The people working on cryptocurrency during this period were doing so because they wanted to, because they found the problems interesting, not because they were trying to get rich quick. But the obscurity also meant that the use cases for cryptocurrency remained limited. Yes, some people were using Bitcoin for international remittances, or to preserve wealth in countries with unstable currencies, or to make purchases on the remaining dark web markets. Yes, some people were experimenting with DeFi protocols or building decentralized applications on Ethereum. But the scale was small. Cryptocurrency was not displacing traditional finance. It was not becoming the universal medium of exchange that early believers had envisioned. The question that hung over the crypto winter was whether cryptocurrency would ever achieve mainstream adoption, or whether it would remain a niche technology used by a small community of enthusiasts. The technology worked, in a sense. Bitcoin processed transactions reliably. Ethereum allowed smart contracts to be executed. But working technically and achieving broad adoption were different things. Traditional finance had enormous advantages. It was established, trusted, regulated, insured. It had better user interfaces, better customer service, legal protections. For most people, the benefits of cryptocurrency, decentralization, censorship resistance, pseudonymity, weren't compelling enough to outweigh the disadvantages: volatility, complexity, lack of consumer protection, regulatory uncertainty. So cryptocurrency persisted in a kind of limbo through 2018 and 2019. Not dead, but not thriving. Not growing rapidly, but not disappearing. Just continuing, maintained by a dedicated community, slowly improving, waiting for something to change. That change would come in 2020, though not in the way anyone expected. A global pandemic would shut down economies, governments would respond with unprecedented monetary stimulus, and the questions cryptocurrency had been asking about the nature of money and value and trust would suddenly seem more relevant than they had in years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let's rest here for a moment, in the quiet of the crypto winter, in the patient work of building when no one's watching, in the discipline of holding through decline. Think about the developer writing code for a DeFi protocol in 2019, working for modest pay or maybe for tokens that were nearly worthless, believing that what they were building mattered even though hardly anyone was using it yet. The satisfaction of solving technical problems, of creating something new regardless of price or attention. Or think about the person who bought Bitcoin at $19,000 and watched it fall to $3,000, a loss of more than 80%, and decided to keep holding, or even to buy more, believing that eventually the market would recognize Bitcoin's value. The courage or foolishness, depending on your perspective, of maintaining conviction when everything suggests you're wrong. Or consider the institutional teams at Fidelity or Bakkt, building cryptocurrency custody and trading infrastructure during a bear market, making a long-term bet that cryptocurrency would become an established asset class, even though the current evidence suggested the opposite. The patience to build for a future that might not arrive. The crypto winter was a test of different kinds. Not the test of whether the technology could handle rapid growth, but the test of whether it could survive stagnation. Not the test of whether people would believe during euphoric booms, but the test of whether they would continue believing through long, grinding declines. Cryptocurrency passed this test too, though not perfectly, not without casualties. Projects failed, people lost money. Faith was tested and sometimes broken, but the core technology continued functioning. The community persisted. The work continued. Let your breathing settle into that rhythm of patient persistence, of work continuing through difficulty, of belief maintained through doubt. There's no excitement here, no drama, just the steady continuation of effort despite obstacles, despite setbacks, despite uncertainty about whether the effort will prove worthwhile. We're approaching the end of our journey through cryptocurrency's history, moving toward the present day where questions remain unanswered and the story continues to unfold. But for now, rest in this quiet period, in the winter when growth was invisible but still occurring, when prices were low but infrastructure was being built, when attention was elsewhere but important work was happening. The blockchain continued growing, of course, block after block, transaction after transaction, maintained by miners who kept working because the economic incentives remained even when prices were low. Because the system was designed to continue functioning regardless of sentiment or attention. Let that constancy be a comfort. Systems that keep working, work that continues, time that passes, winters that eventually end. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, imperceptibly, until one day the cold begins to fade and hints of spring appear. We'll continue shortly. The year 2020 arrived with Bitcoin trading around $7,000, a recovery from the $3,000 lows of late 2018, but still far below the heights of 2017. The cryptocurrency community was cautiously optimistic, hoping the crypto winter was ending, but uncertain about what would come next. Then in March 2020, something happened that no one in cryptocurrency had predicted or planned for. a novel coronavirus, COVID-19, began spreading globally. Within weeks, countries were implementing lockdowns, economies were shutting down, stock markets were crashing. The world was entering a pandemic unlike anything most people alive had experienced. In the immediate chaos of March 2020, Bitcoin crashed along with everything else. From around $9,000 in early March, it fell to below $4,000 on March 13th, losing more than half its value in days. The correlation with traditional markets was stark. Bitcoin, which had often been described as uncorrelated to stocks, as a hedge against traditional financial system problems, was falling just as hard as the stock market. But then something different happened. Governments around the world, particularly the United States, responded to the pandemic with unprecedented monetary stimulus. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates to near zero and announced unlimited quantitative easing, essentially printing money to buy bonds and support the economy. Congress passed the CARES Act, a $2 trillion relief package that included direct payments to millions of Americans. In the months that followed, more stimulus would come, more money printing, more fiscal spending. The scale was staggering. In a matter of months, the money supply expanded more than it had in decades. The phrase "money printer go" became a meme, a humorous way of describing the Federal Reserve's aggressive expansion of the money supply. For Bitcoin advocates, this was a profound moment. One of Bitcoin's core value propositions had always been its fixed supply. There would only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. No government could print more. No central bank could inflate the supply. In a world where traditional currencies could be created at will by central banks, Bitcoin represented an alternative, a form of money that couldn't be debased. The massive monetary stimulus of 2020 made this value proposition seem suddenly more relevant. If governments were going to print trillions of dollars, if the money supply was going to expand dramatically, wouldn't that lead to inflation? Wouldn't it devalue existing dollars? And if so, wouldn't hard assets, assets with limited supply, become more valuable relative to expanding currency? This narrative, Bitcoin as digital gold, as a hedge against inflation and currency debasement, began to gain traction. It had existed before, but 2020 gave it new urgency and credibility. Some investors started viewing Bitcoin not as a speculative technology bet, but as a macro investment, a way to protect wealth against monetary inflation. Bitcoin's price recovered from its March lows and began climbing. By July, it was back above $10,000. By October, it crossed $13,000. And in November, it broke through its previous all-time high from December 2017, surpassing $20,000 for the first time. But what made the 2020 rally different from previous cycles was who was buying. This wasn't just retail investors speculating on price movements. This time, publicly traded companies and institutional investors were allocating significant capital to Bitcoin. In August 2020, MicroStrategy, a business intelligence company with over $1 billion in revenue, announced it had purchased $250 million worth of Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset. The company's CEO, Michael Saylor, became one of the most vocal Bitcoin advocates, arguing that Bitcoin was the best long-term store of value in an era of monetary expansion. MicroStrategy's purchase was remarkable because it represented a publicly traded company putting a substantial portion of its cash reserves into Bitcoin. This wasn't a technology company experimenting with cryptocurrency. This was an established business making a serious financial decision that Bitcoin was a better store of value than holding cash. Other companies followed. Square, the payments company led by Jack Dorsey, invested $50 million in Bitcoin in October 2020. Insurance companies, pension funds, family offices, they were all beginning to allocate small percentages of their portfolios to Bitcoin. Then in February 2021, Tesla announced it had purchased $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin. Tesla, one of the most valuable and visible companies in the world, led by Elon Musk, one of the most influential entrepreneurs, was putting Bitcoin on its balance sheet. The announcement sent Bitcoin's price soaring past $50,000. The institutional narrative was powerful and self-reinforcing. As more institutions bought Bitcoin, it became more acceptable for other institutions to consider it. The concerns about Bitcoin being too risky, too volatile, too speculative, were countered by the fact that respected companies and investors were allocating capital to it. Paul Tudor Jones, a legendary hedge fund manager, announced in May 2020 that he was investing in Bitcoin as a hedge against inflation. Stanley Druckenmiller, another prominent investor, said he owned Bitcoin. Even Ray Dalio, founder of the world's largest hedge fund, who had previously been skeptical of Bitcoin, began to acknowledge it might have a place in portfolios. This mainstream acceptance was exactly what Bitcoin advocates had been hoping for. Bitcoin was no longer just for cypherpunks and speculators. It was becoming a legitimate asset class that serious investors discussed seriously. But alongside Bitcoin's rise, something else was happening in the cryptocurrency world. Non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, were exploding in popularity. NFTs used blockchain technology to create unique digital tokens that could represent ownership of digital art, collectibles, music, videos, virtually anything that could be represented digitally. The concept wasn't entirely new. CryptoKitties, a game where people bred and traded digital cats represented by NFTs on the Ethereum blockchain, had briefly gone viral in late 2017. But in 2020 and especially 2021, NFTs became a cultural phenomenon. Digital artists who had struggled to monetize their work in traditional ways were suddenly selling pieces for thousands or even millions of dollars. Beeple, a digital artist, sold an NFT of his work for $69 million at Christie's auction house in March 2021. The sale made headlines around the world. Digital art, which could be copied infinitely, was somehow worth millions because blockchain technology could prove ownership of the original. The NFT boom was both fascinating and perplexing. Critics pointed out that anyone could view or download the digital art that NFTs represented. The NFT didn't give you exclusive access to the image, just ownership of a token that referenced the image. What exactly were people buying? What value did this ownership have if the underlying asset could be freely copied? Supporters argued that ownership itself had value, that the same logic applied to traditional art where anyone could buy a poster of the Mona Lisa, but only one institution owned the original. The NFTs were creating new ways for digital creators to monetize their work and for collectors to own unique digital items. Whatever the merits of these arguments, the NFT market grew explosively through 2021. Trading volume reached tens of billions of dollars. Celebrities and brands launched NFT collections. Gaming companies integrated NFTs. The same speculative fervor that had characterized our CEOs in 2017 seemed to have migrated to NFTs. Ethereum, which hosted most NFT activity, benefited from this boom. The price of Ether rose from around $730 at the start of 2021 to over $4,000 by May, then after a summer dip, to a peak around $4,800 in November 2021. Meanwhile, Bitcoin reached its own peak of approximately $69,000 in November 2021, more than 3 times higher than its previous all-time high from 2017. The total cryptocurrency market capitalization crossed $3 trillion. The scale of the 2020 to 2021 bull market was remarkable. More money, more participants, more institutional involvement, more mainstream awareness than ever before. Cryptocurrency was being discussed on financial news channels as a normal topic, not as a curiosity. Major financial institutions were offering cryptocurrency services to their clients. Countries were beginning to establish clear regulatory frameworks. In June 2021, El Salvador announced it would adopt Bitcoin as legal tender alongside the US dollar. This was unprecedented. A sovereign nation, albeit a small one, making Bitcoin official currency. The announcement was controversial. The International Monetary Fund expressed concerns. Economists debated whether it was a bold innovation or a reckless gamble, but it represented a milestone. Bitcoin moving from alternative currency to actual currency, at least in one country. The environmental concerns about Bitcoin's energy consumption also intensified during this period. Bitcoin mining, the process of solving cryptographic puzzles to add blocks to the blockchain, required enormous amounts of electricity. As Bitcoin's price and hash rate increased, so did its energy consumption. Critics pointed out that Bitcoin used as much electricity as some countries, that much of this electricity came from fossil fuels, that the environmental cost of Bitcoin's security model was untenable in an era of climate crisis. Supporters argued that much Bitcoin mining used renewable energy, that the energy was often excess capacity that would otherwise be wasted, that the security and benefits of Bitcoin justified the energy cost. Elon Musk and Tesla's relationship with Bitcoin illustrated this tension. After purchasing $1.5 billion of Bitcoin and accepting it as payment for cars, Tesla reversed course in May 2021, suspending Bitcoin payments due to environmental concerns. The announcement contributed to a sharp price decline, with Bitcoin falling from around $60,000 to below $30,000 by late June. This correction in mid-2021 felt, for a moment, like it might be the beginning of another crypto winter. But the market stabilized and then resumed climbing in the fall. Bitcoin reached new all-time highs in November. The bull market seemed intact. Ethereum was also undergoing a significant technical transition during this period. In August 2021, the London hard fork implemented EIP 1559, a change to Ethereum's fee structure that began burning a portion of transaction fees, effectively reducing the supply of Ether over time. This made Ether deflationary under certain conditions, adding a monetary policy narrative similar to Bitcoin's fixed supply. Then in December 2021, Ethereum launched the Beacon chain, the first phase of its transition from proof of work to proof of stake. This multi-year process would eventually reduce Ethereum's energy consumption by over 99%, addressing one of the major criticisms of blockchain technology. The DeFi ecosystem that had been quietly building during the crypto winter exploded during 2020 and 2021. The total value locked in DeFi protocols, meaning the amount of cryptocurrency deposited in various lending, borrowing and trading applications, grew from under $1 billion at the start of 2020 to over $100 billion by the end of 2021. People were earning interest by lending cryptocurrency, taking out loans with cryptocurrency as collateral, trading on decentralized exchanges, providing liquidity to trading pools and earning fees. Some protocols offered yields that seemed impossibly high, 20 or 30 or even 100% annual returns. These high yields attracted capital, but also raised questions about sustainability and risk. The complexity of DeFi created new opportunities and new dangers. Smart contracts could be composed together, with one protocol building on another, creating elaborate financial structures. But complexity also meant more ways for things to go wrong. Bugs in smart contracts led to hundreds of millions of dollars being stolen or lost. Flash loan attacks, where attackers borrowed enormous sums for a fraction of a second to exploit price discrepancies, became a recurring problem. Stablecoins grew enormously during this period as well. Tether, the largest stablecoin, grew from around $4 billion in circulation at the start of 2020 to over $78 billion by the end of 2021. USD Coin, another major stablecoin, grew from 400 million to over 42 billion. These stablecoins became crucial infrastructure, allowing people to hold stable value within the cryptocurrency ecosystem without converting back to traditional banking. But stablecoins also attracted regulatory scrutiny. How were the reserves backing these coins managed? Were they truly backed one-to-one by dollars as claimed? What would happen if everyone tried to redeem their stablecoins simultaneously? Regulators began investigating, particularly Tether, which faced questions about the composition and transparency of its reserves. By late 2021, cryptocurrency seemed to be at a crossroads. On one hand, institutional adoption was real and growing. Bitcoin was being taken seriously by major investors and companies. Ethereum was evolving technically and hosting a vibrant ecosystem of applications. Regulatory frameworks were developing in many countries, providing more clarity and legitimacy. On the other hand, the speculative excess was obvious. NFTs of dubious value were selling for millions. DeFi yields seemed unsustainably high. Meme coins with no purpose beyond jokes were reaching multi-billion-dollar valuations. The same patterns that had preceded previous crashes, euphoria, overvaluation, projects with no substance attracting massive investment, were all present. The question wasn't whether another correction would come. The history of cryptocurrency made that inevitable. The question was when it would come, how severe it would be, and what would survive the crash. Let that uncertainty settle for a moment. The pattern repeating yet again, larger this time, more mainstream, involving traditional finance in ways previous cycles hadn't, but fundamentally similar. Enthusiasm building, prices rising, new participants entering. The conviction that this time was different, that cryptocurrency had finally achieved escape velocity, that the next phase would be permanent mainstream adoption, rather than another boom and bust. Think about the person who bought Bitcoin at $60,000 in late 2021, perhaps after reading about institutional adoption, perhaps after seeing headlines about El Salvador or Tesla, perhaps believing they were witnessing the beginning of a fundamental shift in the financial system. They couldn't know that within months the price would be cut in half, that the institutional narrative would prove insufficient to prevent another crash. Or consider the NFT buyers paying hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for digital art or collectibles, believing they were acquiring valuable assets that would appreciate over time. Some of these NFTs would retain value. Many would become essentially worthless. Impossible to sell even for a fraction of the purchase price. Or think about the DeFi users chasing high yields, moving money between protocols, believing they had found sustainable sources of return that traditional finance couldn't match. Some would profit, others would lose funds to hacks or exploits, or simply to projects that collapsed when the market turned. The 2020 to 2021 cycle demonstrated cryptocurrency's continued ability to capture imagination and capital. The amounts involved were staggering. The mainstream penetration was unprecedented. Bitcoin and Ethereum and the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem had survived another winter and emerged into another spring, more robust in some ways, more elaborate, more connected to traditional finance. But the fundamental questions remained unanswered. Was cryptocurrency genuinely useful beyond speculation? Would it ever achieve the mainstream adoption that would justify its valuation? Was Bitcoin actually a good inflation hedge, or just a risk asset that happened to rise during a period of monetary expansion? Were NFTs a revolutionary new way to think about digital ownership, or an absurd speculation bubble? Was DeFi rebuilding finance in a better way, or just recreating traditional finance's risks in a less regulated environment? These questions would become more urgent in 2022, when the answers, or at least the market's verdict on the answers, would arrive with devastating clarity. But we're not quite there yet. For now, rest in late 2021, at the peak, when everything seemed possible, when cryptocurrency seemed to have finally proven itself, when the mainstream adoption that had been predicted for so long seemed to be actually happening. The blockchain continued growing, of course, processing more transactions than ever before, maintaining security, functioning as designed. The technology worked. What remained uncertain was whether the uses people had found for it, whether the prices they were paying for it, whether the faith they were placing in it were justified or sustainable. Let your breathing slow to match the steady rhythm of blocks being produced, of transactions being confirmed, of the system continuing to operate regardless of price or sentiment, or whether the current valuations made any sense. There's something meditative about technology that just works, that continues functioning through boom and bust, through belief and doubt, through attention and neglect. We're approaching the end of our journey now, moving toward the present day where some questions have been answered and others remain open, where cryptocurrency has proven some things and failed to prove others, where the story continues to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. But for now, rest. Let these details settle, the rise and fall and rise of prices, the patterns repeating across cycles, the human tendencies toward enthusiasm and fear, greed and panic, hope and despair. The technology persisting through all of it, maintained by economic incentives and distributed consensus, requiring no one's permission and no one's faith, just continuing block by block, day by day. We'll continue shortly, and so we've travelled together through the story of cryptocurrency, from 2 pizzas and 10,000 bitcoins to a phenomenon that captured the world's attention, from an obscure experiment maintained by a handful of enthusiasts to something discussed by central banks and integrated into traditional finance. We've watched cycles repeat, prices rise and fall, dreams expand and contract, hope give way to despair, and then somehow renew itself again. What can we take from this long, strange journey? Perhaps that human nature remains constant even as technology changes. The patterns of enthusiasm and fear, of speculation and patience, of believing too much and doubting too much, these repeat across all markets, all innovations, all moments when something new enters the world and people try to understand what it means and what it's worth. Perhaps that building anything worthwhile requires patience that extends beyond boom and bust, requires working when no one's watching, requires believing in something even when the evidence suggests you might be wrong. The developers who kept coding through crypto winters, the holders who maintained conviction through 80% crashes, they understood something about time and persistence that speculation alone never captures. Perhaps that the gap between revolutionary promise and messy reality is where interesting things happen, where we learn what actually works and what was only ever hope, where technology proves its value or reveals its limitations. Cryptocurrency promised to change everything, and in some ways it has, and in many ways it hasn't, and the story of sorting out which is which continues still. The blockchain keeps growing, wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whether anyone's paying attention or not. Blocks are being added, transactions are being confirmed, the system continues. There's something comforting in that constancy, in things that persist regardless of human sentiment, that function whether we believe in them or not. You've listened patiently to this long story, to all these details about prices and crashes and technologies and people trying to build something new. Thank you for spending this time here, for letting this story wash over you. I hope you found something valuable in it, some insight or just some company as the day winds down. Let yourself settle now. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. Let your breathing slow to its natural rhythm. The story of cryptocurrency continues, but our time together ends here. The questions that remain unanswered can wait. The future that's uncertain can unfold without your attention. For now, there's just this moment, this breath, this quiet. Sleep well, wherever you are. Dream of innovations and patient builders, of cycles that repeat and seasons that change, of human ingenuity meeting human nature in that eternal dance. Dream of 10,000 bitcoins buying pizza, of that simple transaction that proved something new was possible, of beginnings that seemed small but rippled outward in ways no one could predict. Good night. Let it all go now. Just rest.